If you like calm crime stories with a little humour and just enough soft tension to fall asleep to, you are in the right place. Tonight, we slip into a quiet New York New Year's celebration where the real work is keeping everything smooth. If you enjoy this kind of cozy bedtime story, please like the video and subscribe for more. Chapter 1. Snow, Silk, and a Short List. Mulberry Street wore winter the way some men wore cologne, too much and still somehow right. Snow sat on awnings and window ledges like powdered sugar that nobody had ordered. Streetlights turned the slush into a soft shine, and every passing car added a gentle hiss, the sound of a city trying to keep moving without waking itself up. It was the last day of the year, and New York always acted like it was auditioning for itself on a night like this. Uptown, respectable folks chased chandeliers and orchestra music. Midtown, the loud ones practiced shouting at the sky. Downtown, the tired ones claimed they had secret plans and then fell asleep in their coats. And in Little Italy, behind doors that preferred not to be memorable, the people who lived by rules nobody wrote down prepared for a celebration that needed to feel effortless. Eddie DeParlo moved through the cold with his collar up and his mind already counting. He was not a large man, but he had the steady posture of someone who had learned that calm was a kind of armor. The neighborhood called him Eddie Two Notebooks, partly as a joke and partly because jokes were safer than descriptions. One notebook kept the numbers neat, the other kept the truth neat. Eddie would have argued that both were the truth, just written for different readers, but arguments were how you earned extra errands. He drifted past a bakery long enough to let warmth and yeast and sugar remind him that life could be simpler. Then he kept walking, because life never signed a contract promising that. The door he wanted was unmarked, not mysterious, just not interested in being noticed. He climbed the stairs and knocked in the rhythm that got you answered without sounding eager. A pause, then a second pause, and the door opened to a man with a neat moustache and the expression of a padlock. Eddie offered a small nod, the moustache returned a smaller one, the professional kind that said you may enter but do not get comfortable. Inside was quiet, clean, and trimmed with the faint perfume of coffee, cigar smoke, and the kind of cologne that tried to negotiate with your nose. A few men sat around a table, not gambling, not shouting, not performing for anyone. They talked softly, like they had all decided to respect the ceiling. At the far end sat Frankie the gentleman, hair perfectly arranged as if it had agreed in advance, suit tailored like a second skin, smile built for relaxed confidence. Frankie had the rare talent of making a room feel like it was doing him a favor by existing. He lifted a hand and Eddie came closer. Frankie slid a folded paper across the table, almost affectionate with it. Eddie took it, unfolded it carefully, and read. A guest list. Not a long one either, which should have been soothing. Instead it tightened something behind Eddie's ribs, the way a recipe with only 3 ingredients felt dangerous. With a short list there was no room to hide mistakes, and no extra faces to blur the edges of the night if someone decided to bring their temper as a party favor. Frankie watched Eddie read, then leaned back with a pleasant ease that suggested the world generally cooperated when asked politely. Tonight is simple, Frankie explained, light as conversation and heavy as instruction. A small New Year's celebration. Elegant. No foolishness. We want everyone calm enough to remember their manners and sleepy enough to go home early. That sounds like my kind of holiday, Eddie offered, because humor was the safest handshake. A mild ripple moved around the table, not quite laughter, more like approval filed under harmless. Frankie's smile widened. That is why I like you. You have the soul of an old librarian. Librarians are dangerous. They know where everything is. Frankie tapped the guest list with one finger, gentle but sure. Make sure everyone on that paper gets invited properly. No shouting from a doorway, no chasing anyone down the street. Proper. Eddie nodded, because proper invitations were one of the great inventions of civilization. They prevented people from later claiming they were not told. They gave everyone a chance to pretend they had a choice. Frankie continued, and the room leaned in without moozing. Also, you check the venue. Rosa runs the kitchen, we have music, we have the room, we have champagne. Eddie held up a hand, careful and calm. Frankie, when a man lists supplies like blessings, something is missing. Frankie studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether Eddie should be allowed to be right on a holiday. Nothing is missing. From the side of the table, a heavy-set man with calm eyes cleared his throat. He did not look at Eddie. He looked at his own fingernails, like they were delivering news. The delivery is late. Frankie did not flinch. The delivery will arrive. The heavy-set man let the corner of his mouth twitch. Of course. The city is very reliable. Nobody laughed, which made the joke sharper than a knife kept clean for guests. Eddie tucked the list into his inside pocket and pulled out his notebook. New Year's, venue check, invitations, late delivery, 4 lines that could easily become 30 by midnight. Frankie raised done finger, the way teachers did when the lesson mattered. One more thing, do not improvise tonight. If something goes sideways, you come to me. If someone asks a question you cannot answer, you check and return. If you feel the room getting warm in the wrong way, you get air in it. Eddie understood. New Year's was not at a party, it was a yearly audit of respect. It was a night when every smile came with invisible footnotes, when every toast was also a test. People forgot themselves on New Year's. They drank memories, they drank courage, they drank resentment. You could spend a whole year building peace and lose it in an hour if somebody got sentimental in the wrong direction. I understand. Good. Frankie's hand landed on Eddie's shoulder for a second, a friendly gesture that also counted as a seal. Now go be my librarian, find me my books. Outside again, the cold pinched Eddie's cheeks and clarified his thoughts. He headed toward the venue, a private dining hall above a restaurant with excellent sauce and better discretion. The kind of place where waiters could carry 5 plates with one arm and carry secrets with the other. As he walked, he passed families moving briskly through the snow, kids tugging sleds, couples hurrying as if happiness required punctuality. The city was full of strangers who would later cheer together in the street like lifelong friends. Eddie found that both inspiring and unsettling. A crowd was an animal that could sing and bite without warning. At the restaurant, Eddie nodded to the host and took the side stairs up. The upstairs room was dim and warm, with muted color and soft lamps arranged to flatter faces and calm nerves. Men were setting tables, folding linens, adjusting the angle of chairs the way you adjusted a conversation, slightly and with purpose. Wintergreen sat on a mantel, subtle enough to suggest a holiday without begging for attention. In the doorway to the kitchen stood Rosa Belandi, an apron tied with authority and a look on her face that suggested she personally fought hunger and won. She saw Eddie and sighed, the long-suffering exhale of someone who loved her work and disliked the people attached to it. Eddie, 2 notebooks. Here to count my forks. I would never. I am here to admire your forks. Flattery is like garlic. A little is good. Too much ruins the whole thing. Eddie smiled because Rosa made honesty feel like a public service. How are we? We are fine. Food is fine. Waiters are fine. Room is fine. Men are not fine. Men get nervous around holidays. Holidays demand feelings. Men do not like feelings unless they are wrapped in money. Frankie thinks the delivery will arrive. Rosa made a small sound, half snort, half prayer. Frankie thinks a cat will learn manners if you ask politely. Did it? No. But the cat still lives here, so maybe Frankie was right in spirit. Eddie wrote another note and then walked the room slowly, eyes taking inventory the way his hands took inventory in a ledger. Doors, corners, sightlines, table spacing, the quiet mechanics of a place that needed to hold important people without letting them bump into each other. Enough room between chairs to prevent accidental shoulder contact. A small stage for music. A bar tucked into a corner like it wanted to hear everything and deny it later. On the stage sat an upright piano under a lamp. Old, dignified, the kind of instrument that had witnessed promises and regrets in equal measure. A man wiped it down with a cloth, unhurried, treating wood and keys with respect. Eddie watched for a moment and felt his shoulders loosen. If somebody treated a piano like it mattered, maybe the night would behave. Then he caught voices downstairs, not shouting, not yet, but raised enough to indicate friction. Eddie turned toward the stairwell and listened. Words drifted up like steam. Crate. Late. Not my fault. The familiar chorus of grown men discovering that time was real. Eddie went down. At the bottom of the stairs, a burly driver in a thick coat stood with his hands open as if presenting evidence to the air. His face was red from cold and irritation. Beside him sat a small hand truck with 2 wooden boxes. 2, when everyone expected 4. Eddie stepped into view with the calm of a man entering a library where someone had dared to whisper. The host looked relieved. The waiter looked grateful. The driver looked ready to argue with a lamppost. Evening. What is the situation? The driver jabbed a finger toward the boxes. This is what I got. They told me 4. They told me urgent. They told me if I was late I would hear about it from God himself. I show up and everybody looks at me like I brought socks. Socks can be useful. The driver blinked, the anger losing its grip for a second because he could not find the right place to land it. Eddie kept his hands off the boxes. Touching was a claim. Claims had consequences. What is in these? Glassware, fancy stuff. Nobody wants to drink from regular cups on New Year's. That is true. Regular cups remind people they are regular. A sound escaped the driver that might have been a laugh if his pride would allow it. Eddie nodded toward the warm dining room behind him. Come inside. Coffee. If you faint on my floor, Rosa will unalive me with a spoon, and she will do it quietly so nobody can accuse her of drama. The waiter coughed to hide a grin. The driver followed, not because he suddenly trusted Eddie, but because nobody had offered him kindness all day and kindness was disarming in a neighborhood built on armor. Eddie placed the driver near the host stand and used the phone. He called the warehouse contact and got a man who sounded like he had been sleeping with the receiver under his pillow. I am looking for 2 missing boxes. A groan, heavy with the weight of the entire city. Everybody is looking for something tonight. I am not everybody. This is Eddie, 2 notebooks. A pause. The voice sharpened into wakefulness. Which boxes? Eddie gave the details. Markings, destination, glassware. Paper shuffled. A sigh. Those were loaded 4. I saw it. Then we got a call, diversion, another stop. Some hotel shouting about stemware like the world is ending. So my boxes went on an adventure. Not an adventure, a mistake. Mistakes have addresses. Where are they now? More paper sounds, maybe on a truck headed west side. Eddie closed his eyes for a heartbeat. The west side was a long way to chase glassware, and yet here he was, living the life of a man who hunted cups for a living. Redirect it. I can try. Do not try. Do. The voice on the other end hesitated, then surrendered with a weary sigh. Fine. I will make calls. Eddie softened his tone, the way you softened a chair for an old man. New Year's is making everyone unreasonable. Help me, and I will remember you helped. A small pause. Then, you are good at this, Eddie. I am good at sleeping too. Tonight I have to pick car. He hung up and exhaled. Rosa appeared behind him like a shadow wearing an apron. If those glasses do not arrive, I will serve wine in soup bowls. That might start a trend. It will start a riot. Eddie nodded toward the driver, now holding coffee like it was a warm secret. He brought what he could. Rosa looked the driver over, her expression softened by Kamal degree. Eat a biscuit before you leave. You look like you live on regret. Yes, Mom. Eddie watched the driver accept the biscuit with reverence. Rosa could win wars with baked goods. Upstairs again, Eddie walked the room and imagined bodies filling chairs, laughter rising, the piano smoothing rough edges. He imagined someone saying the wrong name, someone remembering a grievance as if it were a cherished heirloom, someone drinking too much courage. Every possibility sat quietly in the corners waiting to be invited. He pulled out the guest list and read it twice, then once more because the third reading always revealed what the first 2 hid. It was not just names. It was a seating chart of alliances and sensitivities. He started his invitation route as daylight thinned. At the first door, an older man accepted the card with solemn appreciation. The man's sister offered Eddie a cookie and called him thin with the affection of a person who had never asked permission to comment on anything. Eddie took the cookie and let the thin parts slide off him like snow. At the next building, a young man opened too fast and nearly spilled himself into the hallway. Eddie held out the card and let patience do the talking. "The year is not going anywhere. Slow down." The young man nodded, embarrassed, clutching the invitation like it might stop his hands from trembling. Eddie wrote a note after he left. "Seat near calm people. Young men carry fireworks in their ribs." He moved through the neighborhood, door to door, street to street, the messenger of a party that needed to feel like it had always been planned this way. At each stop, someone tried to feed him. Coffee, candies, orange slices, advice. New Year's made people generous, and generosity was one of the ways a community soothed itself into believing it was safe. When he returned to the venue, dusk had settled and the rooms felt warmer, as if the building itself was preparing to host memories. Frankie stood near the top of the stairs watching men adjust linens and lamps, a conductor studying his orchestra before the first note. "How is my librarian? Your books are distributed." Frankie's eyes held the question he did not want to ask. The delivery. The city is still being reliable in its special way. 2 boxes arrived. 2 boxes are sightseeing. Frankie kept the smile, but Eddie saw the jaw tighten. The smallest shift that only a nervous friend would notice. Tonight needs to be smooth. It will be. If the glasses do not arrive, Rossa will invent a new tradition. People will drink champagne from soup bowls and call it old country charm. Frankie let out a real laugh, grateful for a joke that did not threaten anything. Then his tone turned quieter, more honest. "The men coming tonight want to feel like the world is steady, like their choices matter, like the future is not at a messy street with unmarked corners." Eddie nodded. A New Year's party was not only celebration, it was reassurance. A story you told yourself so your hands stopped shaking. Frankie's hand returned to Eddie's shoulder, gentle and firm. "Thank you, and remember, no improvising." Eddie pictured 2 missing boxes on a tour of Manhattan, and kept his face calm. "I will be very boring." Perfect. Eddie looked around at soft lamplight and set tables, at the waiting piano and the quiet, careful staff. Outside, the city was winding up. Inside, this room was trying to lull itself into calm. Eddie opened his second notebook and wrote one more line, a line that was not about numbers at all. "Make the night feel steady." He closed the notebook and imagined midnight arriving gently, like a cat stepping onto a warm cushion. For a single breath, it felt possible. Then the downstairs phone rang again, insisting on reality, and Eddie went to work without hurrying, because hurrying was how you spilled things that mattered. Chapter 2. The invitations travel like rumors. By late afternoon, the neighborhood was full of smells that belonged to easy years and hard ones at the same time. Roasting chestnuts, frying onions, warm bread, cold iron, wet wool, and the faint sharp sweetness of somebody trying to cover up last night with cologne. If you closed your eyes on Mulberry Street, you could map the block by scent alone, which Eddie found helpful, because it saved him from making eye contact with men who were always in the middle of a story. He had already delivered most of the invitations, but invitations were not really paper. Paper was just the costume. The real invitation moved through the neighborhood as soon as the first card changed hands. It traveled across doorways and over espresso cups, through barber chairs and bakery counters, through the simple sentence that made everyone sit a little straighter. "Frankie is hosting tonight." Eddie did not love that sentence. It was too tidy and too loud, even when spoken softly. He pushed open the door to Tony the barber and let the warmth hit him like a friendly slap. Inside, the barbershop glowed with bright bulbs and polished mirrors, and the air smelled of talc, soap, and hot metal from the clippers. A radio played a holiday tune meant for department stores, cheerful in a way that felt slightly ignorant of the world. Tony looked up and grinned, scissors in hand like a magician with a very practical trick. "Eddie, 2 notebooks, come in. You look like you have been chased by a receipt." Eddie took a seat on the bench and accepted the small cup of coffee Tony slid into his hand, because coffee in this neighborhood was not at coffee. It was a greeting, a test, and a small agreement to behave. People in the chairs glanced at Eddie, then glanced away with practiced politeness. They already knew why he was there. If they pretended they did not know, everybody could keep their dignity intact. Dignity and haircuts, Tony provided both. Tony leaned close while he worked on a customer, voice low and casual. The party is real then. Eddie let his face stay neutral. New Year's is real, the party is just the excuse. Tony snorted softly, then clipped at a sideburn with extra care. You hear about the delivery? Eddie blinked once. How did you hear about that? Tony lifted a shoulder without turning his head, the gesture of a man confessing to a minor vice. I cut hair, hair hears things, and people talk when they think the scissors are loud enough to cover it. Eddie took a slow sip. 2 missing boxes and half the neighborhood already had opinions. That was how the city functioned. A rumor fell on the sidewalk, and by the time it reached the curb it had a hat and a last name. It is being handled, Eddie offered, calm enough to be believable, but not so confident that it sounded like a challenge. Tony nodded. Good. Because if men cannot drink properly at midnight, they will take their complaints out on innocent furniture. Chairs do not deserve that. Eddie watched the door while he drank, eyes steady and quiet. The people who came into Tony's shop were always coming in for something, even when they came in for nothing. Haircuts were sometimes the excuse. Sometimes the excuse was just the warmth. A boy, maybe 12, pushed through the door with newspapers tucked under his arm. He called out headlines like they were carnival announcements, half habit and half performance. Politics, sports, a winter storm, a mayor smiling for a camera. The boy looked around as if measuring who might be generous, then noticed Eddie and paused. Mr. Eddie, the boy said, a little too loud. Are you going to that upstairs party? Tony laughed, a sharp bark that made one customer flinch. Listen to this kid. He is going to grow up and wound us all. Eddie made the smallest motion with his hand, asking the boy to lower his volume without embarrassing him. Which upstairs party? The boy grinned, enjoying himself now. The one where the men smell like cigars and decisions. Tony made a sound of admiration. That is poetry, kid. Dangerous poetry. Eddie handed the boy a coin and kept his tone gentle. Get yourself something warm. And tonight, do not hang around doors. Doors are where accidents happen, and the city will not apologize. The boy nodded as if he had been given a secret assignment rather than a warning. Yes, sir. Then he backed out, leaving the bell over the door to ring a little longer than necessary. Tony finished his customer and finally turned his full attention to Eddie. Be careful tonight. New Year's makes everyone sentimental. Sentimental men do foolish things, like hugging. Eddie made a face that suggested hugging was a civic nuisance. Pray for me. Tony lifted his scissors like a blessing. I will. Eddie left before Tony could offer him a haircut, because a haircut would mean sitting still, and tonight was not a night for sitting still. He walked 2 blocks through slush and streetlight and hurried footsteps. Snow fell again, light and persistent, the sort of snowfall that looked pretty and behaved like paperwork. Eddie's shoes made soft crunch sounds that felt too loud. His next stop was a small upstairs office over a fish market where a friend of Frankie kept extra supplies and paperwork. The stairwell smelled like salt, old wood, and ambition. Eddie knocked, and the door opened to Sal, a man with tired eyes and a face that looked like it had been negotiating with problems since breakfast. Sal leaned on the frame. Eddie, I was hoping you were not coming. Eddie stepped in. I have that effect on people who store things. The office was cluttered with boxes, stacked files, and a calendar with so many days crossed out it looked like somebody had been trying to defeat time with a pencil. A radio hummed quietly in the corner, a steady murmur the way a stove murmured in a warm kitchen. Sal poured a small glass of something that smelled like it could wake a stone statue. Eddie declined with a polite shake of his head. Sal accepted the refusal like he respected Eddie's hobby of staying functional. I got a message from down by the docks. Somebody is sniffing around. Eddie kept his posture relaxed, but his thoughts tightened. Sniffing. Questions. Friendly questions, like a cat pretending it is not interested. Sal sat down and rubbed his forehead. It is New Year's, people ask questions anyway. but these questions have teeth hidden in them. Eddie took out his second notebook and wrote a single word: sniffing. Then he looked up again. What kind of somebody? Sal hesitated, then decided Eddie was safer to inform than to leave in the dark. Not our crowd. A woman. She dresses like she belongs in a newsroom, eyebrows like she is always about to raise them. Eddie pictured 100 women in 100 newsrooms, then one face formed clear in his mind, because some faces were distinctive even when you tried not to notice them. Millie Kerrigan. He had seen her once near City Hall during a commotion, notebook in hand, hat angled just right, eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that could cause trouble without meaning to. Sal continued, and his voice carried mild irritation, the kind reserved for smart people who might misuse their brains. She asked about Frankie. She asked about a private room upstairs. She asked who plays music. She acted like she was writing a story about holiday magic. Eddie sighed softly. Holiday magic was what reporters called other people's business. Did she say her name? Eddie asked. Sal nodded. Millie Kerrigan. I asked around because I do not enjoy surprises. She writes for one of the city papers. Not the worst one, still a paper. Eddie thanked Sal with a nod, then stood. Where did she go after? Sal lifted a palm. That I cannot say. She went into the city like smoke. But Eddie, listen. She was not hostile, no anger, no threats, just that polite curiosity that makes you feel like you owe her an answer. That was the dangerous kind. Eddie wrote Millie Kerrigan in his notebook and underlined it once, softly, as if to keep the pencil from panicking. Sal watched him. You going to tell Frankie? Yes. Sal leaned back. Tell him this too. If she is sniffing, so is somebody else. Reporters do not show up alone. Not for long. Eddie nodded. He believed that attention always drew more attention. It was like lighting a match in a dark room. You saw what you needed, and you also announced yourself. He left Sal's office and stepped back into the street. The afternoon had turned fully into evening, and the neighborhood looked like a snow globe shaken by an impatient child. The lamps, the snow, the wet cobblestones, the glow from windows, pretty if you ignored the fact that everything under the beauty was constantly negotiating. Eddie headed toward the restaurant venue, but his mind detoured toward the West Side truck. Those missing boxes were still out there somewhere, riding around Manhattan like tourists who refused to ask for directions. He stopped at a payphone under an awning and called the warehouse again. This time he got a different voice, younger and more nervous, the kind that spoke quickly because silence felt risky. Eddie asked for an update without sounding like it was an order, which was a delicate skill. The answer came with cautious optimism. The truck was being redirected. The boxes should arrive before the party truly began. Should was the most dangerous word in the English language, but Eddie accepted it because he had no better option. As he hung up, he noticed a figure across the street, half concealed by a passing couple in the shadow of a doorway. A woman, hat low, notebook in hand, watching the flow of people without looking like she was watching. Millie Kerrigan had the posture of someone pretending to be casual while taking mental photographs. Eddie did not approach immediately. Approaching would make her feel important. Ignoring her would make her feel invisible, and invisible was exactly the state reporters hated. So he did the middle thing. He walked toward the bakery window as if he wanted to buy bread, then paused just long enough for his reflection to line up with her. Her eyes met his in the glass for a brief moment. She smiled, small and confident, and wrote something down. Eddie thought, wonderful. Now I am a character. He turned and walked toward her, not with urgency, just with the calm of a man who belonged on this street, 'cause he did. He stopped at a polite distance, leaving space for both dignity and escape. Evening, he offered. Millie looked pleasantly surprised, as if she had been hoping for this and also could claim she had not. Evening? You are Eddie DeParlo, yes. Eddie kept his face calm. And you are Miss Kerrigan? Millie tucked her notebook against her coat for a moment, still visible but less aggressive. I am. I am only looking for some human colour. The city loves its stories tonight. People will be reading over breakfast, deciding how to feel about the new year. Eddie let that sit. He did not like being described as human color, but he also understood that reporters were just people who turned the world into paragraphs. Human color, Eddie repeated, on Mulberry Street. Millie smiled. Exactly. It feels warmer down here, like the city still remembers how to be a neighborhood. Eddie glanced at the snow. Warm was a generous word. Millie leaned in only slightly, voice lowering as if the street had ears, which it did. I heard there is a private celebration. Nothing scandalous, I hope, just a gathering, music, food, that sort of thing. Eddie chose a tone that stayed friendly while offering no handle to grab. New Year's brings gatherings everywhere, some louder than others. Millie nodded as if that was exactly the quote she wanted, even though it gave her nothing. True. Still, your neighborhood gathers in a different way. There is tradition here. I like tradition. Eddie thought, you like copy. He offered her an exit that was also a boundary. If you want tradition, write about families making dinner, kids playing in the snow, the smell of bread. That is real. That is what lasts. Millie studied him with an expression that looked kind and sharp at the same time. You are telling me to stay away from the door upstairs. Eddie gave her a small smile. I am telling you that doors are boring. The street is bettered. Millie laughed softly, and Eddie noticed her laugh was quiet, almost considerate. Not all reporters were hungry wolves. Some were cats. Cats still cause trouble, but sometimes by accident. All right, she agreed. The street it is. But if I write about the street, I will mention the men who keep it calm. Eddie kept his voice steady. Mention the bread. Mention the snow. Mention the radio playing a song nobody likes. Leave the rest for the new year. Millie tilted her head. You sound like a man who wants the new year to arrive quietly. Eddie nodded. Quiet is underrated. Millie stepped back, then offered a small, sincere nod that felt surprisingly respectful. Happy New Year, Mr. DePaulo. And then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the moving crowd like she had never been there at all. Eddie watched her go for a second too long. Then he reminded himself that watching was what created stories, and he did not want to be a story. He returned to the venue. Inside the restaurant, the downstairs hum had changed. More coats, more footsteps, a little more excitement leaking into the corners. The host gave Eddie a look that asked 5 questions at once. Eddie answered with a calm nod that meant, not yet, but soon, and do not panic. Upstairs, Frankie stood near the bar, greeting staff and checking the room with the eyes of a man trying to keep an ocean flat. Eddie approached and leaned in close enough for privacy. There is a reporter sniffing around. Millie Kerrigan. Sal saw her, and I saw her just now across the street. Frankie kept his expression pleasant. Of course. The city does not let a quiet celebration stay quiet. What does she want? A story. Human color was her phrase. Frankie nearly smiled wider. Human color. That is polite. Better than calling us colorful criminals. Eddie kept his voice low. She said she likes tradition. She asked about a private celebration. I gave her bread and snow. I suggested she stay on the street. Frankie nodded slowly, absorbing the information the way he absorbed everything, like a gentleman accepting a bill without making a face. Good. Keep her fed with harmless details, and she will not go hungry for the dangerous ones. Rosa appeared, wiping her hands on her apron like she was wiping away the very concept of nonsense. A reporter. I will feed her soup bowls and send her home. Eddie glanced at Rosa. The soup bowls are still on standby. Rosa pointed toward the stairs. Go check the delivery again before I start inventing new traditions. Eddie did not argue with Rosa when she was in full command voice. He went downstairs and to the phone. The call returned better news. The missing boxes were on the way, and the driver had been warned that arriving late would earn him the kind of disappointment that lasted into February. Eddie thanked the voice on the other end and hung up, choosing to believe it because belief was occasionally a tool. As he turned, he nearly collided with a man coming in from the street. The man wore a plain coat, plain hat, plain expression, the kind of plain that required practice. His eyes were tired, not cruel. His face looked like it had spent too many nights listening to people lie badly. Detective Harold Pike. Eddie recognized him from a distance, from a few previous sightings at the edge of neighborhood commotions. Pike was the sort of detective who looked more annoyed by chaos than excited by it, which made him both less dangerous and more unpredictable. They stopped just short of bumping shoulders. Eddie stepped aside politely. Pike did the same. "Evening," Pike offered, voice calm like he was talking to any citizen in any doorway. "Evening," Eddie replied, matching the calm because calm was contagious if you handled it right. Pike glanced around the restaurant, not scanning like an enemy, more like a man checking whether he would have to write paperwork later. Busy night. "It is New Year's," Eddie answered, giving Pike the most ordinary truth on earth. Pike nodded, then lowered his voice, not conspiratorial, just practical. "I do not want trouble in this neighborhood tonight. Nobody wants trouble. People want to shout and kiss and sing, and then wake up with headaches and pretend they regret nothing." Eddie watched him carefully. Pike's tone was not a threat. It was almost a request. Eddie chose his words with the care of a man placing glassware on a narrow shelf. "Trouble is loud. We prefer quiet." Pike's mouth twitched at the corner. Not quite a smile, more like a man appreciating honesty in a city that rarely offered it. "Good. Keep it quiet. Keep your friends from feeling brave. My feet are tired." Eddie nodded as if they were two working men discussing weather, which in a way they were. "I can appreciate tired feet." Pike shifted his gaze to Eddie's face, measuring. "And Eddie, one more thing. There is a reporter poking around, Millie Kerrigan. I saw her near the corner." Eddie kept his expression neutral on the outside while his thoughts did a small irritated dance. Everybody saw her. She was practically a parade. "So did I," Eddie admitted. Pike exhaled, a man already imagining tomorrow's headlines. If she prints something foolish, people get excited. If people get excited, somebody does something regrettable. Then I do paperwork. I do not like paperwork. Eddie almost smiled. I also do not like paperwork. That might be the one thing we have in common. Pike gave him a look that contained mild amusement and mild warning at the same time. Then protect both of us. Let her write about snow and bread, not about names. Eddie held Pike's gaze briefly and nodded once. Understood. Pike stepped back toward the street. "Happy New Year, Eddie." He said it the way a man said a polite phrase while hoping the universe would cooperate. "Happy New Year, detective." Pike left, coat collar up, moving into the night with the steady pace of a man counting hours until his shift ended. Eddie stood still for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. A reporter and a detective, both orbiting the same quiet celebration. The night was already gathering eyes, and eyes were heavier than snow. He went upstairs again and found Frankie near the piano, speaking softly with the man scheduled to play later. The pianist looked like he had seen too many parties and survived by staying unimpressed. Eddie leaned in. "Pike is here. He does not want trouble. He also knows about Millie." Frankie nodded slowly, smile still in place, but his eyes sharpening. "The city is full of helpful people tonight," Rosa called from the kitchen doorway. "Eddie, the soup bowls are looking jealous. Confirm the glasses." Eddie lifted a hand toward her. "On the way. I have it." He turned back to Frankie. "The boxes are coming. Soon. At least that is what the warehouse says." Frankie breathed out quiet relief, then smoothed it into a pleasant expression and turned his attention back to the room. "Good. Keep the night steady, Eddie. Make it feel like the future is not a street corner with bad lighting." Eddie nodded, then stepped away to do what he did best. He walked the room and checked details. He counted chairs. He adjusted a lamp so it softened faces instead of casting sharp shadows. He spoke quietly to waiters, reminding them to move like they had all night to move. He listened to the building, to the thin sounds of downstairs, to the street noise outside, to the gentle sigh of the radiator, all of it forming a kind of sleepy rhythm. A party, he reminded himself, was not only the people, it was the atmosphere. And atmosphere was something you could manage, like heat, like light, like the tone of a conversation you did not want to turn. He returned to the stairwell as the first guests were expected soon, and he paused there, breathing in the calm air upstairs, letting it settle into him. Outside, Manhattan was winding up. Times Square would soon be a loud, bright animal. But here, on this small street with its snow and its bread and its careful rules, the goal was simpler. Keep it gentle, Keep it quiet. Keep it steady. Downstairs the doorbell rang, and the host's voice rose in a greeting. The first guest had arrived, and the night had officially begun its long walk toward midnight. Chapter 3: The Band Problem and the Piano That Remembers. The first guests arrived with the careful energy of people stepping into a room that could judge them. Coats were handed off with extra politeness. Hugs were offered and then converted into handshakes at the last moment, as if everyone remembered that sentimentality was easiest to manage when it stayed at arm's length. Upstairs, the dining hall filled slowly. Not crowded yet, just occupied, which was different. Occupied meant the room had purpose. Crowded meant the room had opinions. Eddie moved through the space the way a stagehand moved through a theatre. Quiet, efficient, eyes always on angles and timing. He gave small signals to waiters encouraging calm. He adjusted a chair by an inch. He moved a lampshade so it softened faces instead of carving them into sharp shadows. He checked the bar twice, and then checked it a third time because bars were like children. They behaved best when they felt watched. Frankie stood near the entrance to the room, greeting people with a smile that never looked forced. It was a skill. Some men smiled like they were trying to sell you something. Frankie smiled like he was welcoming you into a story with a happy ending. Rosa remained in the kitchen doorway, partially visible like a guardian statue, watching everyone the way a hawk watched a field. She had the expression of a person prepared to feed the entire neighborhood and scold it at the same time, which was a very old and very effective kind of love. The only corner that still felt unfinished was the stage area, where the piano waited under the lamp. The upright looked dignified and patient, like an old man in a good suit sitting quietly and judging the music of the modern world. The pianist intended for the night, a thin fellow named Artie Vitali, arrived earlier and took one look around with a calm that bordered on suspicious. His hands were long, his nails trim, his coat too light for the weather. The kind of man who survived winters by refusing to admit they were real. Eddie had spoken with him briefly earlier and learned the important details quickly. Artie did not enjoy loud drunks, did not tolerate requests shouted from across rooms, and did not believe that a holiday was a reason to play like a circus. Those were all promising qualities. Now Artie sat on a stool near the piano, hands resting on his knees, waiting for his cue in the same way a cat waited for you to stop staring at it. Eddie approached with a calm nod. "Everything all right?" Artie's gaze lifted without enthusiasm. "Everything is fine. The piano is old. Old is good. Old usually behaves." Eddie glanced at the keys. "She looks tired." Artie leaned forward and tapped a single key softly. The note rang out, gentle and slightly mournful. "She remembers things. That is why she sounds tired." Eddie liked that. A piano that remembered things fit the evening. He let Artie have his quiet moment and stepped away. That was when Frankie's smile tightened for the first time. Frankie did not announce it, he simply appeared at Eddie's side, and the air around him shifted by a degree. Eddie recognized the change, like noticing when a clock started ticking louder. Frankie leaned in close enough to keep the conversation private. Problem. Eddie kept his face relaxed. What kind? Music kind. Eddie's eyes drifted toward the stage. Artie was there. The piano was there. What did Frankie mean? Frankie continued, voice low and polite, which was always a sign that the problem had teeth. The band. The little string group for the early part, the soft background. They are not coming. Eddie held the pause for a beat, letting his mind assemble possibilities. Not coming like late, or not coming like vanished. Not coming like suddenly sick, Frankie added, with light sarcasm and not much patience. Which is amazing because they were healthy this morning, and now they have all become delicate at once. Eddie nodded slowly. A coordinated illness was one of the oldest traditions in New York. Frankie's eyes stayed pleasant while his mouth stopped smiling. I do not want a room full of men staring at each other in silence. Silence makes them think. Thinking makes them remember things they pretend they forgot. Eddie glanced at Artie again. The piano can carry a lot. Frankie made a small grimace. Artie is good, but I promised a little swing, a little warmth, something that makes the wine taste smarter. Eddie felt the weight of the task settle on him. Finding musicians on New Year's Eve was like trying to borrow a clean shirt after midnight. Possible, but everyone would have questions. I will fix it, Eddie offered. Frankie's gaze held Eddie's for a moment, and in that look was the real pressure. Note at music, but the feeling the music created. Keep the night steady. Eddie nodded once and turned toward the stairs, already thinking of the places where musicians hid. Music halls, small clubs, union halls, hotel lobbies, theatres where the night staff stayed late listening to rehearsal scraps. As he descended, Rosa caught his sleeve lightly. "Where are you going? Band trouble." Rosa's expression sharpened. Music trouble on a night like this is never music trouble. It is ego trouble. Eddie gave her a calm look. "I will return with something that sounds like gentle hope." Rosa released him. "Bring something that also sounds like it knows when to stop." Eddie went out into the street. The cold hit him again, clean and direct. The city had shifted into a different gear, more carriages, more taxis, more people moving like the night had an appointment. Snow still fell, light and persistent, catching in hat brims and coat shoulders. Eddie headed toward a small club on the edge of the neighborhood where musicians sometimes took side work. The entrance was plain. The sound from inside was warm and muffled, like laughter behind curtains. Inside, the room smelled of smoke, spilled drink, and perfume. A small band played near the back, not too loud, mostly horns and a soft snare, the kind of sound that made people lean toward each other and pretend they were smooth. Eddie approached the bar and asked the bartender for the band leader, keeping his tone polite but efficient. The bartender gave him a look that translated to, "New Year's is not a time for favors," then pointed with his chin. The band leader was a man with a wide grin and narrow eyes, the sort who liked attention but did not trust it. Eddie waited until the set ended, then approached with a gentle smile. "Nice playing," Eddie offered. The band leader took in Eddie's suit, Eddie's posture, Eddie's calm. "Thanks. You want to hire me or arrest me?" Eddie replied smoothly. "Hire. Tonight. Private event, soft background, good food, respectful room." The band leader's grin widened. Respectful room is a charming phrase. "How much?" Eddie hesitated. Talking money in a room like this felt like yelling in a library. Also, Eddie did not like inventing numbers without permission. Frankie had specifically asked for no improvising. Eddie tried a different approach. "I am not here to bargain. I am here to see if you are free and interested. If you are, I will bring you to the host and you can settle details like gentlemen." The band leader studied him, impressed despite himself. "Who is hosting?" Eddie kept it vague, because names were not candy. People came, people eat, people listen. It is New Year's, you know. The band leader laughed quietly. "That means someone important." Eddie did not confirm. He simply waited, like an empty space inviting the other man to fill it. The band leader looked toward his players, then back to Eddie. "I would, but my boys are booked. Hotel gig, Midtown. They want loud, they want glitter. They want the kind of night that makes everyone regret their shoes tomorrow." Eddie nodded. Midtown would swallow them whole and call it celebration. The band leader leaned closer. "But I might know a trio. 2 strings and a clarinet. They play soft, they read a room, they take requests as a suggestion, not as an order. They are good." Eddie felt a small relief. Names. The band leader scratched his chin. "The Sorelli boys, plus a clarinet man called Benny Pockets. Do not ask why. It is not polite." Eddie almost smiled. Nothing in this city was polite, but everyone pretended. "Where do I find them?" Eddie asked. The band leader pointed with his thumb. They were going to play a private supper near the Bowery, but the supper got cancelled. Somebody in the party decided a hangover was more dignified than dancing. The trio might be at the Musicians' Union Hall or at the cafe across from it, drinking coffee and complaining about the state of art. Eddie thanked him and left. On the way, he passed a newsstand and saw a familiar hat brim turn just slightly toward him. Millie Kerrigan, standing close enough to appear casual, far enough to avoid being obvious. Her notebook was tucked under her arm, but her eyes were working. Eddie considered walking right past her. Then he remembered what Detective Pike had asked, and what Frankie needed, and the truth that ignoring reporters was like ignoring a leak. It did not stop it. It just made it wetter. Eddie crossed the street with a calm pace and stopped beside her, as if they were two neighbours discussing weather. Millie's smile arrived instantly, light and practiced. "Mr. DeParlo, out enjoying the holiday." Eddie let a dry note enter his voice. "I enjoy errands the way some people enjoy root canals." Millie laughed softly. "Your earlier advice about the street was sound. There is plenty to write about. Families, snow, the bakery windows that look like little theatres." Eddie nodded. "That is the right kind of story." Millie's eyes flicked briefly toward the restaurant's upstairs windows. "Still, the private room upstairs is very interesting." Eddie offered her a gentle boundary. "Interesting rooms are everywhere. Interesting names are in newspapers. You can one or the other." Millie leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I'm not trying to start trouble. People have enough trouble. I want a scene. I want atmosphere. I want a New York moment." Eddie looked at the snow, then back at her. "Then write about a man running through the cold to find music before midnight. That is a New York moment." Millie blinked, delighted by the hook. "That is you, then." Eddie did not deny it. He simply took the moment and shaped it. A man doing his job. Quietly. No drama. Millie lifted her notebook, ready to capture the phrase. "Give me a line, something human." Eddie gave her something harmless and true. "Tonight is about keeping the year from ending badly. That is all." Millie wrote it down with a small nod, as if she appreciated honesty, and the party upstairs. Eddie kept his tone calm. "The party upstairs is about soup bowls that do not want to become famous." Millie laughed again, softer this time, and Eddie noticed she laughed like someone who did not want to wake a sleeping child. "All right, I will write about the street. But Mr. DeParlo, if you do something noble tonight, I will notice." Eddie offered a small, tired smile. "Please do not call errands noble. It makes the errands feel arrogant." Millie stepped back, eyes bright. "Happy New Year, Mr. DeParlo. Happy New Year." She let him go, which Eddie appreciated. He moved on quickly because the best way to keep a story from growing was to stop feeding it. He reached the Musicians' Union Hall and found it lit like a modest office, practical and slightly weary. Two men stood outside smoking, coats open despite the cold, as if they wanted to prove they could survive anything. Eddie asked politely for the Sorelli trio. The men glanced at him, judged his shoes, then pointed him toward the cafe across the street. Inside the cafe, the warmth and smell of coffee hit him. A trio sat in a corner booth, instruments cases stacked neatly beside them like sleeping dogs. Two young men with similar faces, and an older man with a narrow moustache and a clarinet case that looked like it had travelled more than he had. Eddie approached with careful politeness. "Excuse me." The older man looked up, eyes tired but sharp. "If you are selling anything, the answer is no." Eddie kept it simple. "I'm looking for the Sorelli boys and Benny Pockets." One of the younger men laughed quietly, embarrassed. "He really is called that now." The older man's mouth tightened. People have no respect. Eddie nodded. "Respect is the theme of the night. I have a job. Private event. Upstairs room, good food, soft lighting, and a strict preference for calm. We need gentle music, not fireworks." The older man studied Eddie, then looked at the boys. The boys looked at him for approval, the way musicians looked at the person who did the talking and also did the worrying. The older man asked, "Who is it for?" Eddie chose the truth that did not contain names. "People who want the year to end quietly. People who value manners." One of the brothers leaned forward. "That sounds like people who tip well." Eddie did not promise numbers, he promised a concept. "That will be negotiated properly, with respect." The older man tapped the table once, thinking, "New Year's is a tough night. Everybody wants music. Everybody wants it now. Why are you asking us?" "Because I heard you can read a room," Eddie replied. "And because the room I have cannot afford music that starts arguments." The older man nodded slowly, almost pleased. "That is true. Music can cause trouble. People think it only causes dancing," one of the brothers asked. "What kind of music?" Soft swing, warm Italian standards, a little jazz that does not get excited, Eddie explained. The kind of sound that makes conversation nicer, not louder. The older man leaned back. That is our sound. Eddie felt relief try to enter his chest, and kept it from getting too comfortable. There was still the question of time. We need you soon, Eddie added. Before the room decides silence is a hobby. The older man exchanged a glance with the boys. Then he nodded. We can do it. But conditions. Eddie accepted the word conditions like a man accepting rain. Name them. No requests shouted across the room, the older man began. If someone wants a song, they ask a waiter politely, and the waiter asks us politely. Also, no drunk men leaning on my clarinet. Also, if someone insists on singing, we will pretend we cannot hear them. Eddie almost smiled. Those are excellent terms. And, the older man added, we want to be introduced properly, note like background furniture. Eddie nodded with respect. I can arrange that. And one more thing. The piano man upstairs, Artie Vitali, he will be part of it. You comfortable sharing space? The older man's eyes narrowed. Artie Vitali. The thin poet who thinks every note is a confession. One of the brothers grinned. He is good, though. The older man sighed as if remembering a past argument. He is good. Fine, we will behave. Eddie offered his hand. Then let it rescue the night. They gathered their cases, paid for their coffee, and followed Eddie out into the street like a small, tidy parade. On the way back, the city felt louder. More laughter. More horns. A group of young men ran past carrying paper hats, already celebrating as if they had practiced all year. Eddie stepped aside to let them pass, feeling old at an age that was not particularly old. At the restaurant, the host opened the door quickly, relief visible for a moment before he remembered to hide it. Eddie led the trio upstairs. Frankie met them near the top of the stairs and greeted them with a smile that warmed the space around it. Gentlemen, thank you for coming on short notice. You are doing us a kindness tonight. The older man gave a small bow of the head, respectful. We like kindness. We also like being paid, but kindness first. Frankie laughed softly. Of course, both will be handled properly. Eddie introduced them to Artie near the piano. Artie looked up, eyes cool, then let his gaze settle on the clarinet case and the string cases. His mouth twitched slightly. I see we are building an orchestra. The older man replied without heat, only enough to keep the room from panicking. Artie nodded toward the piano. She can do a lot alone. Eddie offered a calm reminder. And she will. But the night asked for a little extra comfort. Artie touched a key again, letting a soft note ring out. Comfort is expensive. Frankie clapped his hands lightly, not loud, just enough to gather attention. A quick sound check, then you begin softly. Keep it smooth, keep it warm. They set up without fuss. Chairs adjusted, music stands placed, cases opened with care. The piano lamp cast a soft circle of light over hands and wood and brass. Eddie stood a few steps back and watched, feeling the night settle by a degree as the room noticed there would be music after all. Guests continued arriving, coats were taken, glasses clinked gently, laughter remained restrained, polite, like everyone had agreed to keep their volume in the same key. Then, from downstairs, a familiar thud and scrape carried up the stairwell. Eddie's attention snapped toward the sound. A delivery. He moved quickly but smoothly down the stairs. At the bottom, a driver stood with 2 more boxes on the hand truck, cheeks red with cold, eyes wide like he had sprinted through every traffic light in Manhattan. The driver blurted, I got them! I got them! Please tell the soup lady not to look at me like that." Eddie opened Dunbox carefully. Glassware, clean and intact. The kind that made people feel like their lives were arranged. Eddie nodded. "You did good." The driver exhaled, relief pouring out of him. "Thank you. Happy New Year, Happy New Year. Eat a biscuit before you go, it will protect you." The driver nodded vigorously and hurried toward the kitchen, where Rosa's silhouette already waited like judgment. Eddie carried the boxes upstairs with help from a waiter. The staff began placing the glasses with quiet efficiency, and the tables looked complete, as if the room had always been this prepared. On the stage, the musicians began a gentle rehearsal. A soft melody, warm and slow, like a blanket laid carefully over restless thoughts. The piano joined, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, and the clarinet slid in like a friendly voice telling a story you already trusted. Eddie stood near the back of the room and listened. The music did not demand attention, it encouraged it. Conversation softened, smiles loosened. The air changed from cautious to comfortable, which was exactly what the night required. Frankie approached Eddie with a quiet look of approval.
You found the right sound.
Eddie kept his voice low.
The right sound is one that does not create new problems.
Frankie's smile returned in full. You are very good at preventing problems before they get interesting. Eddie gave a mild shrug. Interesting is for newspapers. As if summoned by the word, Eddie caught a glimpse through the window of Millie Kerrigan across the street, her hat visible beneath a street lamp. She watched the building for a moment, then turned away, writing as she walked. Eddie let her go. The music continued, calm and warm, the kind that could trick a room full of careful men into believing they were simply neighbours at a holiday dinner. Eddie knew better than to believe it fully, but he also knew the value of pretending for one night. He took out his second notebook and wrote a line that felt like a small victory. Music secured, glassware arrived, soup bowls spared. Then he closed the notebook and let himself stand still for 10 whole seconds, listening to the piano that remembered things and the clarinet that insisted on manners, while the city outside built itself toward midnight, loud and bright and hungry. Inside, for now, the room stayed steady. Chapter 4. Champagne that prefers to vanish. The room settled into a rhythm that felt almost honest. Music drifted like steam from a good kitchen. Conversation stayed low. Laughter arrived in small waves and then receded, as if everyone had agreed to keep the shoreline tidy. The night was behaving, which always made Eddie nervous because the city rarely behaved for long without demanding payment. Eddie moved between tables with the quiet focus of a man checking loose threads on a fine coat. He watched hands and eyes more than faces. A face could smile. Eyes told you what the smile was doing behind your back. Mostly the eyes looked relaxed. Mostly the hands held glasses and forks and nothing else. It was a good start. Frankie worked the room with light charm, greeting older men with warm respect, younger men with calm encouragement, and everyone in between with that gentle confidence that made people want to match his manners. Frankie did not only host parties, Frankie hosted moods. Rosa ran the kitchen like a courtroom. Plates came out steady. Waiters moved like shadows that knew where every chair leg lived. The soup bowls remained safely unused, which Rosa considered a personal triumph. Eddie allowed himself to breathe. Then he saw Frankie glance toward the bar and freeze for half a beat. Frankie recovered quickly, a smile still in place, but the pause was the kind you noticed if you spent your life reading pauses. Frankie drifted toward Eddie, not rushing, just closing the distance like a man approaching a window because he heard weather. Eddie leaned slightly toward him, ready. Frankie kept his voice low and pleasant, but the words were not pleasant. The champagne is not here. Eddie stood still and let that sentence settle in his body. Champagne was not a luxury in a room like this. It was a symbol. It was the shiny promise that the year would end properly. It was what you held at midnight so you could pretend you were toasting the future instead of negotiating with the past. Eddie asked a quiet question. Not here at all. Frankie gave him a calm look that did not bother pretending. The bar has enough for early service, there are bottles, but the good cases, the ones we promised, the ones with the right labels and the right story, they did not arrive. Eddie nodded slowly. The good ones, of course, the ones people would notice. Frankie continued, still smiling at a guest across the room while speaking to Eddie as if they were discussing lighting. I do not want men drinking something ordinary at midnight. Ordinary makes them think they are being treated as ordinary. Eddie let a dry note slip into his tone, carefully contained. The city has a personal grudge against ordinary. Frankie almost smiled wider, grateful for humour that did not add trouble. Then his eyes sharpened again. Find out where it is, quietly. Eddie did not ask for more instruction. He did not need it. The job was simple in language and complicated in reality. Retrieve the champagne. Keep the room steady. Keep the night from becoming a story. Eddie moved toward the stairs without hurrying, because nothing made people curious faster than a man moving like he had somewhere urgent to be. He paused at the edge of the kitchen doorway and caught Rosa's attention with a small gesture. Rosa stepped closer, wiping her hands on her apron like she was wiping away impatience. What now? Champagne problem. Rosa stared at him for a long moment, then made a sound that was half sigh and half threat. Men and their bubbles. Without champagne, they act like the year will not turn. Eddie gave her a small nod. I will handle it. Rosa leaned closer, voice low enough that only the steam could hear it. Handle it means you bring it. Not promises, not explanations. Bring it. If I have to serve midnight toast with coffee, I will do it, but I will also hate everyone. Eddie agreed silently and went down. Downstairs, the host had the phone in his hand, looking like it had insulted his family. Eddie took over without ceremony, because ceremony was for midnight. He called the same warehouse contact again. A different voice answered, older, sharper, like a man who had been yelled at all day and decided to become immune. Eddie gave the venue name and the missing delivery details. The voice on the other end responded with mild impatience masked as competence. Champagne, it repeated. You mean the cases marked for your address? Yes, those went out. They did not arrive. A pause. Paper sounds. Another pause. I see the paperwork says delivered. Eddie kept his voice calm. Paperwork also says the city is reliable. The voice made a low, humorless sound. It says signed for. A name. Eddie asked for the name, and his stomach already knew he would not like it. The name given was when Eddie did not recognize Newt the host, Newt the driver, not anyone on the staff. Eddie wrote it down slowly, then asked for the location of this delivery confirmation. The voice hesitated, then offered a broad answer. West Side Docks, transferred near the piers. That is what it says. Eddie closed his eyes for a brief moment, again with the west side. Manhattan was large, but it had a specific talent for sending Eddie to the same inconvenient places twice in that day. Eddie thanked the voice without sounding sarcastic, because sarcasm rarely improved logistics. Then he hung up and reached for his coat. Outside, the cold had grown teeth. Wind pushed snow along the street in small, irritated swirls. A cab passed, tires hissing on slush. Somewhere, laughing voices rose from a doorway, the kind of laugh that did not know it was about to become a headache. Eddie walked fast but not frantic, heading for a place where trucks and crates did not get lost by accident. The West Side Docks, Hudson River Piers, a part of town that smelled of salt, rope, diesel, and men who carried the weight of other people's celebrations. He took a cab part way, then walked the last stretch because the streets near the piers were too congested with deliveries and arguing for any driver to pretend he enjoyed it. The dock area was a tangle of trucks, carts, men carrying boxes, men yelling at men carrying boxes, and men standing still like they were paid by the minute to look unimpressed. Eddie approached a small office near a gate where a watchman sat behind a window, hat low, eyes up. The watchman looked Eddie over with the slow patience of a man who had seen too many people pretend they belonged. Eddie offered a polite nod and a simple request. I am looking for a delivery that went missing. Champagne cases, wrong signature. The watchman did not move much. Everybody is looking for something. What makes your something special? Eddie considered his answers. He could mention names, but names were slippery on docks. He could mention consequences, but consequences sounded like threats. He chose the simplest truth. It is New Year's. People upstairs are trying to pretend the world is steady. I would like to help them. The watchman stared at him for a moment longer than necessary, then shifted his gaze slightly to the side. Over there. Foreman shed. Ask for Lou. Eddie thanked him and walked toward the shed. Inside, the foreman was a thick-armed man with a face lined by wind and annoyance. He held a clipboard like it was a weapon. His name, according to the crooked sign behind him, was Lou, and he looked exactly like a Lou. Eddie waited for a gap in the shouting, then stepped in. Lou. Lou soured his expression. Who are you? A man trying to find a delivery that got signed for by someone who is not my people. Lou grunted. That happens. Eddie kept his tone calm and respectful. It should not happen twice in one night. Lou narrowed his eyes. Twice. Glasses earlier, champagne now. Eddie did not explain further. Explaining was how you invited questions, and questions were how you invited delays. Lou asked for paperwork. Eddie showed the note with the signature name, the address, the delivery mark. Lou scanned it with a look that suggested he was reading something he already disliked. Lou jerked his chin toward a stack of papers. We got deliveries. They go where they go. Sometimes a case lands wrong. Sometimes it lands right and somebody walks off with it. Eddie let a dry humor settle into his voice. Usually the somebody is not a ghost, though. This signature is new to me. Lou scratched his cheek like he was shaving invisible stubble. That name. I saw it. A guy here earlier. He said he was from your restaurant. Eddie held Lou's gaze. He was not. Lou shrugged. I am not a priest. I do not bless identities. He had a truck. He had a hand truck. He had confidence. Confidence is 90% of the city. Eddie nodded. That was true enough to be depressing. Where did he go? Eddie asked. Lou pointed loosely, toward the warehouse storage, then out. Maybe toward a different truck, maybe toward a different street. Lou watched Eddie carefully. You making there a big thing? Eddie chose a tone that made things smaller instead of larger. I am making it a quiet thing. A quiet thing is always better. Lou grunted again. There is a small crew that has been hovering around, acting like they run the wind. They have a guy with a shiny scarf and shoes too clean for a dock. If your champagne went for a walk, that guy probably held the leash. Eddie thanked Lou and stepped back outside. A shiny scarf and clean shoes. That was a dock description that meant only one thing. Someone wanted to be seen. Someone wanted the theft to be a message. Eddie walked between trucks and crates, scanning faces, watching for the wrong kind of neat. He spotted it near a stacked pallet of lumber. A man leaning casually against a post, scarf bright even in the dim light, shoes clean enough to be offended by slush. Two other men stood nearby, hands in pockets, posture relaxed in a way that only people with protection could afford. The scarf man noticed Eddie immediately. His smile arrived like a stage light. Friendly, bright, not quite trustworthy. Eddie approached with a calm pace and stopped close enough to speak but not close enough to be crowded. The scarf man started first, voice smooth, playful. You look like you lost something. It is New Year's, happens to everybody. Eddie kept his tone mild. I lost champagne. The scarf man placed a hand on his chest like he was personally wounded. Champagne, that is tragic. A crime against celebration. Eddie let the word crime hang without reacting. The scarf man continued, enjoying himself. I might have heard about champagne walking around. The docks are full of wandering things, cratids, rumours, sometimes a man with a plan. Eddie asked the simplest question. Do you have my cases? The scarf man tilted his head, considering. It depends. How do we define yours? Did you make the bubbles yourself? Eddie did not smile. He did not frown. He stayed steady. The cases were meant for a party upstairs on Mulberry Street. They were signed for by someone who lied. I am here to correct that. The scarf man shrugged lightly, as if correcting lies were a hobby. Maybe somebody corrected the route for you. Maybe somebody decided your party needed a little surprise. Eddie let a hint of sarcasm into his voice, careful and small. Surprises are wonderful when they come wrapped in ribbon. Less wonderful when they come wrapped in theft. The scarf man laughed quietly. Theft is a harsh word. I prefer misunderstanding. Eddie took a breath and chose diplomacy, because diplomacy was how you moved objects without breaking people. All right, misunderstanding. Help me unmisunderstand it. The scarf man stepped closer by half a step, still relaxed. And why would I do that? Eddie considered again. He could offer money. Money was simple but also insulting in the wrong context. He could offer threats. Threats were loud. Eddie had been asked for quiet. He chose the third option, the one the city truly ran on. I can owe you something. The scarf man smiled wider, pleased. Now we are speaking the city language. Eddie continued. Not a blank check. A reasonable favour, the kind that fits on one line. The scarf man tapped his own scarf as if it were a tie. I like lines. Lines keep men honest. Tell me your line. Eddie kept his voice low. You return the champagne. Tonight remains smooth. In return you get an invitation to avoid a problem next month. The scarf man laughed again, and this time there was a sharper edge. What problem? Eddie answered honestly, because honesty was sometimes the fastest road. A reporter is sniffing around this neighbourhood. She likes stories. She likes New Year's. She likes human colour. She will write something bright if you give her something bright. The scarf man narrowed his eyes slightly. Reporter. Millie Kerrigan. The scarf man made a small sound, like a man tasting something sour. That unasks questions like she is paying rent on them. Eddie nodded. Exactly. I can steer her gently away from certain details. I can also suggest a different angle, a different subject. Someone else perhaps who enjoys being seen. The scarf man stared at Eddie for a long moment, then smiled slowly. You are clever. You are telling me you can redirect a paper story away from my friends. Eddie corrected softly. I am telling you I can try. But your friends should also try not to be interesting. The scarf man laughed, amused and a little impressed. We are always interesting. But fine. I like the idea of a quieter week after New Year's. My mother likes reading the paper without spitting into her coffee. Eddie waited. The scarf man turned his head and nodded once toward one of his men, a gesture so small most people would miss it. The man walked away without hurry, because hurry would admit guilt. The scarf man returned his attention to Eddie. How many cases? Eddie answered. Enough that midnight does not feel cheap. The scarf man smiled at that. A man after my own heart. Midnight should never feel cheap. It makes the whole year feel cheap. Eddie took out his notebook for a moment and wrote one line, not the details, just the agreement. Favour owed, reporter redirected, champagne returned. He did not show it. The act of writing was for his own sanity. The scarf man watched him write, amused. You really do have 2 notebooks. Eddie put it away. It is a medical condition. The scarf man chuckled. You know, if you had asked nicely the first time, maybe this misunderstanding never happens. Eddie looked at him steadily. If I ask nicely, do you return things you take? The scarf man spread his hands. Sometimes. On holidays. Eddie held his patience and let the moment pass. After a few minutes, the other man returned with a hand truck, and behind him were the champagne cases, intact, stacked neatly as if they had simply been waiting for Eddie to arrive with the correct tone. Eddie checked the markings without making a show of it. The right cases, the right story, the right labels that would help important men feel important at exactly midnight. Eddie nodded once. This will do. The scarf man lifted a finger, almost playful. I'll understand. Eddie kept his voice calm. I will keep her on bread and snow. I will not let her chew on names. The scarf man looked satisfied. Good. Because names make people brave. Brave makes people stupid. Stupid makes people late for dinner. Eddie did not argue with that philosophy. He simply took the hand truck and began moving it toward the street. The scarf man called after him, friendly as ever. Happy New Year, librarian. Eddie did not look back. Happy New Year. He navigated the hand truck carefully, avoiding puddles and uneven boards. The crates were heavy, not just in weight but in symbolism. He passed the watchman again and received a small nod of approval, as if Eddie had just completed a local ritual. Eddie caught a cab and directed it back downtown. The driver complained about traffic, about tourists, about the concept of midnight. Eddie agreed politely and focused on keeping the crates stable. When he returned to the restaurant, the host opened the door with relief visible for a heartbeat before manners returned. Eddie rolled the crate in, hands steady, face calm, like champagne rescues happened every day. Rosa appeared instantly, eyes sharp. Is it? Eddie nodded. It is. Rosa exhaled like a storm passing. Good. Now the men can drink their bubbles and pretend they invented the year. Eddie allowed himself a small smile. We will be ready. Upstairs, waiters moved into action, swapping in the good bottles with quiet speed. The bar looked fuller, the room looked more complete. Music continued to soften the edges of conversation. Frankie approached Eddie near the back, expression still pleasant, but his eyes asked the real question. Eddie answered before it could be spoken, champagne recovered, quietly. Frankie let his shoulders drop by a fraction. Beautiful. You see, the city can be reliable. Eddie kept his voice low and dry. The city is reliable in the way a cat is reliable. It shows up when it feels like it, and it expects praise for existing. Frankie laughed softly, a real laugh that did not polish itself first. Then he leaned in. Any cost. Eddie chose his words carefully. A small favor. Nothing dangerous. I can handle it. Frankie held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. All right. We will discuss it later. For now, enjoy the fact that you saved midnight. Eddie looked around the room at faces relaxing, at glasses catching lamplight, at the stage where old songs turned into warm air. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a janitor of moods. But on New Year's, that might be the same thing. He returned to his quiet circuit, checking tables, watching eyes, listening for the first hint of heat in a conversation. Outside, the city roared toward midnight. Inside, the room stayed steady and the champagne waited like a promise. Eddie touched his notebook in his pocket, not to write, just to reassure himself it was there. The year was ending, the new one was approaching. And for now, the bubbles were back where they belonged. Chapter 5. The Kitchen Council. If the dining room was a theatre, then the kitchen was the courthouse. The dining room allowed smiles and compliments and polite lies. The kitchen allowed none of that. In the kitchen, time was the judge, heat was the jury, and Rosa Belandi was the bailiff, the prosecutor, and the whole legal system with an apron tied tight. It was the kind of kitchen that stayed busy without looking frantic. Pots simmered with steady confidence. Trays moved in and out like commuters who knew the schedule. The air carried garlic, tomato, oil, roasted meat, and that warm bread smell that made grown men feel 10 years old for a second before they remembered their pride. Eddie drifted in at the edge, careful not to block anyone. In a kitchen like this, standing in the wrong place was a crime. The waiters moved quickly but quietly, as if the floor might complain if they stepped too hard. Rosa stood at the center of the storm, hands on hips, scanning the room with eyes that could measure salt by looking at steam. She did not shout. She did not need to. The kitchen obeyed her like a well-trained orchestra obeyed a conductor who had once thrown a spoon with perfect aim and did not regret it. Eddie waited until her gaze flicked to him, then offered a small nod. Rosa did not smile. You came back with bubbles. Good. The year can now turn without a tantrum. Eddie kept his tone mild. I tried to protect the soup bowls from becoming famous. Rosa made a small sound of approval. Good. Soup bowls deserve peace. A waiter rushed past with a tray of antipasto, then stopped short when Rosa lifted a finger. He froze like someone had switched off his legs. Rosa pointed toward the pass with a short motion. That tray. Too much oil. It shines like a waxed floor. Fix it. The waiter nodded fast and vanished to correct the shine, as if shine alone could unalive a celebration. Eddie watched, quietly impressed. Some people ran organizations with threats. Rosa ran one with standards. He leaned closer, careful, everything steady. Rosa glanced toward the dining room doorway. For now, men are men. They eat and they relax, and then they start remembering. Remembering is what ruins their digestion. Eddie thought about that. The party upstairs was designed to keep remembering from turning sharp. Food helped, music helped, soft lighting helped, but food also created its own politics. Who got served first? Who got the best plate? Who felt slighted by the angle of a garnish? The city never ran out of ways to create meaning from nothing. Rosa wiped her hands on a towel, then motioned Eddie toward a small side table near the pantry. Over there. Stand where you will not get trampled. Eddie obeyed. Within a minute, 2 older women appeared in the kitchen doorway as if summoned by the scent of authority. They wore coats over dresses and expressions that suggested someone had asked them to do a favour, and they had agreed, because they enjoyed being right. One of them was Carmela, a cousin of someone important, and the other was Teresa, a friend of Rosa who treated cooking like a moral duty. They carried trays of pastries covered with cloth, as if transporting sacred objects. Rosa greeted them with a nod. "You are late." Carmela lifted her chin. "I am not late. The street is late," Teresa added. "The snow is disrespectful this year." Rosa accepted the pastries, uncovered done tray, and inspected the cookies like an inspector at a factory. "These are good." Carmela looked pleased and tried not to show it. "Of course they are good." Rosa turned her gaze to Eddie. "Eddie, 2 notebooks, here to count our sins." Eddie offered a small smile. "I'm here to make sure nobody drops fat of your cookies and starts a war." Teresa laughed, quiet and dry. "He understands. Good." Rosa set the pastries aside and leaned in toward all of them, lowering her voice. "We have a kitchen council, 10 minutes, because I want this night clean." Eddie blinked. A kitchen council sounded like a thing that made rules and also scolded you for breathing. Carmela nodded, serious now. "Good." Because upstairs I already saw men looking at each other like they are measuring their chairs. Teresa added, "They will behave if they are fed properly, and if they are not fed properly, they will still behave, but then they will gossip for a month. Gossip lasts longer than sauce." Rosa pointed at Eddie with her towel. "That is why he is here. He listens, then he moves chairs like a magician." Eddie did not deny it. It was accurate. They gathered near the side table, where kitchen noise provided a natural cover. Rosa spoke first because of course she did. "Tonight has 3 dangers," Rosa began. 1, men drink too fast. 2, men talk too loud. 3, men take something personally that is not personal. Carmela nodded. "That last one is their favourite hobby." Teresa glanced toward the dining room. "I saw the young girt table near the stage. The one with the slick hair. He acts polite, but his eyes run ahead of his mouth." Eddie knew the type. Young men who believed suits made them wise. He wrote a note in his head. "Watch the slick youth. Keep him from standing too often." Rosa continued. "We already solved done problem, the bubbles. Good. But now I want to solve the small problems before they become big." Carmela leaned closer. "The seating." Rosa lifted her eyes. "Yes. Seating is not just seating. Seating is approval. Seating is a story." Teresa added, "Seating is also how close someone is to the kitchen, which matters to me personally." Rosa gave her a look. "Teresa, do not seat people based on your feelings." Teresa replied calmly, "I seat people based on who deserves better food." Rosa sighed. "This is why I do not let saints run parties." Eddie offered a gentle interruption. "There is also the matter of conversation flow. Some men should not be placed across from each other when wine is involved." Carmela nodded, "Like cousins at a wedding." Rosa pointed her towel again, approving. "Exactly. You see, we are aligned." A waiter appeared, a young man named Nico, holding a tray and wearing a nervous expression. He stopped in the doorway like he wanted permission to exist. Rosa turned her head slowly, and the kitchen seemed to go quieter. "What?" Nico swallowed. "The bar upstairs asked if we are sending more bread soon. They are clearing it like they have not eaten in a week." Rosa lifted an eyebrow. "They eat bread like it is an apology. Tell them more is coming, and tell them to use butter like people, not like animals." Nico nodded and turned to go, relief in his shoulders. Carmela watched him leave. "That boy is new." Rosa made a small noise, "new and soft." Which is not a crime, but it makes him easy to blame when men feel bored. Eddie felt his attention sharpen. A soft waiter on New Year's Eve in a room full of important men was a fragile situation. Teresa agreed. "I saw someone snap fingers at him upstairs, like he is a dog." Rosa's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Teresa gave a name, low and careful. "An older man with a pinky ring that looks like it has its own ego." Eddie recognized the description even without the name. There were always a few men who treated manners as something other people owed them. Rosa took a breath and forced calm into it. All right, we keep the boy away from that table. Put him with families. Put him with the friendly men who like jokes. He will loosen up. Eddie nodded. I can do that. Carmela leaned in again, lowering her voice. And what about the men from across the river? The ones Frankie invited because it looks good to have them. Rosa's expression tightened. I do not love guests who bring their own weather. Eddie understood. Frankie had invited a couple of out-of-neighborhood connections because New Year's was a time to show polite unity, even if it was only a performance. Men did that with smiles and careful toasts. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it turned into a quiet contest for who could look more unbothered. Eddie offered an observation. If they are here, they should feel respected but not entertained. There is a difference. Teresa nodded. Entertainment makes them think they are the center. Carmela added, the center is already crowded. Rosa tapped the table once, concluding, fine. The plan. More bread. Slow service on the hard drink. More food on the tables so nobody has an excuse to stand and wonder. And keep the soft waiter safe from the men who like snapping fingers. Eddie met Rosa's gaze and nodded. I will handle the waiter rotation. Rosa held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then softened, just a little. Good. Eddie is useful. That is my favorite kind of person. Eddie accepted the compliment with the same caution he used for wine. Rosa's approval was valuable and also came with expectations. The kitchen council broke apart. Carmela went back to adjusting desserts like she was arranging art. Teresa began lecturing a pot of sauce as if it could hear her standards. Rosa returned to command. Eddie stepped out into the hallway and headed upstairs, moving smoothly, not fast. Upstairs the room had grown fuller, the music remained warm and gentle, the lights stayed soft. The champagne glittered behind the bar like it was proud of itself. Frankie drifted through conversations like a fish through water, never splashing. He spotted Eddie and gave the smallest nod, the silent question. Eddie returned the smallest nod, the silent answer. Under control. Eddie found Nico near the bar carrying a tray with careful hands. The young man's eyes were focused on not dropping anything, which meant he was not focused on people, which was how you bumped into trouble. Eddie stepped close enough to speak quietly. Nico. Nico looked up, startled. Yes. Eddie kept his tone calm and kind. You are doing fine. Tonight is busy. People act strange because they think the calendar gives them permission. Nico nodded, grateful for any logic. Thank you, Eddie continued. In 5 minutes, I want you to switch to table by the window. They are families. They tip well and they talk slow. It will catch your breath. Nico's shoulders relaxed by a visible degree. Thank you. I was worried I was doing something wrong. Eddie shook his head. You are doing something right. You are careful. That matters. Nico blinked, surprised. Then he nodded and moved on. Eddie watched him go and then scanned the room for the pinky ring man. He found him near the center, holding a glass and talking with a lazy confidence. Pinky ring, full suit, the air of a man who believed the world owed him small conveniences. As if on cue, the man snapped his fingers once toward a waiter passing by. Eddie stepped in, not aggressive, just present. He did not address the snap directly. Instead, he addressed the man as if everything was already polite. Good evening. How are you enjoying the food? The pinky ring man looked Eddie over, mildly annoyed at being interrupted by courtesy. It is fine, but service is slow. Eddie offered a practiced smile. We're keeping it smooth tonight. Too fast makes people restless. Restless makes people stand and bump into each other. Nobody wants to bump into anyone. The man narrowed his eyes, realizing Eddie was not a waiter. You running this? Eddie stayed modest. I am helping. The man sipped his drink, then waved his hand dismissively. I want more bread. Eddie nodded as if the request were perfectly reasonable. Bread is coming. In the meantime, I recommend the antipasto. It is excellent and it gives your hands something to do besides snack. The man stared for a moment, caught between offense and humor. Then he made a small laugh, reluctant. You got jokes. Eddie shrugged lightly. New Year's is expensive, humor is free. The pinky ring man's posture loosened. Fine, bring the bread. Eddie inclined his head and drifted away, having accomplished the important thing. He had redirected the man's behavior without challenging his pride. Pride was like a match, it burned best when you ignored it. Eddie returned to Frankie near the bar and leaned in slightly. The soft waiter is moving to family tables. Also, the man with the ring is being managed. Frankie glanced toward the center and smiled. Managed. That is a beautiful word. You make it sound like we are running a hotel, not a room full of egos. Eddie kept his tone dry. Hotels have more pillows, egos have fewer. Frankie gave a quiet laugh and clapped Eddie on the shoulder once, gentle. Good work. The party continued building toward midnight. Wine flowed steadily, food arrived in waves, the music stayed warm and calm. Conversations began to soften, and Eddie noticed something that always happened when people got fed properly. The sharp edges dulled, voices lowered, men leaned back in their chairs and remembered they had shoulders. Then the first small mistake appeared, innocent and dangerous. A waiter, not Nico, carried a tray of champagne flutes toward a table near the stage. His foot caught on a chair leg that should not have been angled out. The tray tilted. Glass clinked sharply. For 1 second the room held its breath. The waiter recovered fast. Nothing fell, no glass shattered, no champagne spilled, but the sound had cut through the music like a needle. A few heads turned. A few eyes narrowed. The pinky ring man smirked as if he had been given proof that the world was sloppy. Eddie moved immediately, not rushing, but arriving beside the waiter with calm authority. He did not touch the tray. He did not grab the waiter. He simply placed himself there like a wall against panic. The waiter's face was pale. "Sorry," he whispered. Eddie lowered his voice. "You did fine. You recovered. That is what matters." Across the table, one older guest lifted his chin, irritation rising. "Watch where you are going." Eddie turned slightly toward the guest and offered a calm smile. "Absolutely. The chair legs can be sneaky. They like attention." The guest blinked, thrown off by the odd phrasing. Then his irritation softened into mild amusement. "Chair legs," Eddie continued smoothly. "We will keep them in line. Enjoy your drink." The guest nodded and turned back to his conversation. The moment dissolved, the room exhaled, the music resumed full control. Eddie guided the waiter toward the side, away from eyes. In the hallway, he spoke softly. "Tonight feels heavier than usual, I know. But you did not spill, you did not break anything. You do not need to carry that moment around." The waiter swallowed. I thought he would start yelling. Eddie kept his tone steady. People yell when they feel ignored. You did not ignore him. You gave him a second to feel important, then you kept moving. That is how you survive a room like this. The waiter nodded, still pale. "Thank you." Eddie paused, then made his choice. It was small, but small choices were what made nights end clean. Eddie reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill, not flashy, just practical. "Get yourself a coffee on your break, and breathe." The waiter stared. "You do not have to," Eddie replied gently. "I do not have to do anything. I am choosing." The waiter nodded slowly, eyes wet but controlled. Then he walked back into the room with straighter shoulders. Eddie remained in the hallway for a moment, letting his own heart slow. He had protected a waiter from becoming a scapegoat. That mattered. It also created a tiny risk. Kindness could be misread. Kindness could be turned into expectation. Eddie accepted the risk because he preferred being the kind of man who chose. When he returned to the kitchen doorway, Rosa was there, watching him the way she watched boiling water, attentive and evaluating. Rosa gave him a look. "I saw you." Eddie kept his face neutral. "What did you see?" "I saw you stop a moment from becoming a story," Rosa replied. "I saw you protect a waiter the way you protect table settings. Like everything matters." Eddie did not know how to respond to that, so he chose honesty. Everything does matter, if it leads to a worse thing. Rosa stared at him for a long second, then nodded once, decisive. "Good. That means you are the right kind of useful." She leaned closer, voice low enough that only the steam could witness it. "The men upstairs think they run the night. They do not. People like you and people like me run the night. Quietly, with bread and chairs and timing. Eddie felt a small warmth behind his ribs, not pride exactly, more like relief that someone saw the work. He nodded once. I will keep it steady. Rosa pointed toward the kitchen. Go eat something. If you faint, I will unalive you with a spoon, and then I will have to clean up more than plates. Eddie almost smiled. Yes, Rosa. He took a plate from a waiter and ate standing up in the hallway, facing the wall like a child in trouble. The food was excellent, of course. Rosa did not allow anything else. Each bite calmed him a fraction, as if the sauce itself carried instructions. Slow down. Pay attention. Let the night pass. When he returned to the dining room, the party felt smoother again. The champagne flutes shimmered. Conversations sounded warmer. People leaned closer, not to argue, but to confide simple things. Stories about the old neighborhood. Jokes that landed gently and then floated away. Near the window, Eddie caught a glimpse of Millie Kerrigan outside again, notebook in hand, walking past without stopping. She looked in briefly and then continued on, as if satisfied with her angle. Eddie hoped she stayed satisfied. Satisfaction was a rare and useful thing. Frankie found Eddie near the back and offered a quiet nod. How are we? Eddie answered with the calm truth. The kitchen council is in control, the waiters are steady, the champagne is in place. The room is still asleep enough to behave. Frankie smiled, pleased. Beautiful. Keep it that way. Midnight is coming. Eddie looked at the clock and felt the year narrowing toward its final minutes like a hallway leading to a door. He adjusted a chair by an inch, straightened a napkin, and then did what he had done all night. He listened. He watched. He kept the night from becoming something it was not supposed to be, and for now it worked. Chapter 6. Midnight Mass and the Softer Kind of Guilt. The night outside was getting louder, but upstairs the room stayed wrapped in a calm that felt carefully constructed, like a blanket tucked in at the corners. The trio played a soft swing that made even tired people feel graceful. Artie let the piano speak in quiet sentences, never demanding attention, only guiding it. The waiters moved with steady purpose. The plates arrived warm. The champagne waited like a promise that wanted to keep its word. Eddie kept doing his small jobs, the invisible ones that made the big ones possible. He watched the doors, because doors were where the world entered. He watched the bar, because bars were where confidence grew legs. He watched the gaps between conversations, because that was where old grudges liked to crawl out and stretch. Frankie drifted through the room with that easy charm that made a gathering feel like an honor instead of an obligation. He greeted men like he remembered their birthdays, even when Eddie knew he mainly remembered their leverage. Frankie also had a special skill with older guests. He made them feel respected without making them feel old, which was a narrow path, and Frankie walked it like he was born there. Rosa appeared now and then in the doorway, scanning plates and faces, adjusting portions with a look. She did not smile often, but when she did, it was usually at a waiter who had found his rhythm, or at a guest who complimented the sauce with the proper level of sincerity. Time moved, slow and steady. The clock did not hurry. The city did. The city always did. At a little before 11, a subtle shift ran through the room. Not panic, more like awareness. Midnight was coming. The year was almost finished, and people began acting like the calendar was a door they had to walk through in a certain posture. Some guests leaned toward each other and spoke softer, as if confiding last-minute resolutions. Some laughed louder, as if trying to scare away the next year before it arrived. A few stared into their glasses with the kind of attention that turned liquid into philosophy. Eddie noticed Frankie step toward the corner where the older men sat. These were the ones with heavy history in their shoulders, the ones who spoke slowly and listened like they were weighing every word on a scale. They were calm, but they carried a quiet gravity that made younger men adjust themselves without knowing why. Frankie did not interrupt them. He waited at the edge and let the conversation reach a natural pause, the way you waited for a waiter to set down a tray. Then he leaned in with respectful warmth. Gentlemen, if you would like, we can do the old thing. A quick appearance, a little air, a few quiet steps. One of the older men, a narrow-faced fellow with silver in his hair, nodded once. The old thing. Another man smiled faintly. If we do not do it, our mothers will hear about it in the next life. A third man grumbled. My mother already hears everything. They rose slowly, not with stiffness but with intention. Their movement drew attention without requesting it. Eddie watched the younger men notice, then pretend they had not noticed, then subtly angle themselves to see where the elders were going. Everyone wanted to be near tradition, even if they claimed they were above it. Frankie turned to Eddie with a small look that asked for coordination. Eddie responded with a small nod that promised it. A quick walk, Frankie murmured. We keep it simple. No gathering crowds, no drama. Eddie understood. The old thing was not just about belief. It was about proving the neighborhood still had a center. On New Year's Eve, people liked to touch something steady, even if only for a minute. Eddie stepped toward the trio and gave a discreet signal. Keep playing softly. Keep the room warm while we step out. Do not let silence start thinking. The clarinet man gave a polite nod. Artie touched a key and let a gentle note float, like a promise that the room would not be left alone with its own thoughts. Eddie moved to the stairs. Two trusted men followed, not bodyguards in the dramatic sense, more like escorts for dignity. They walked as if they were simply going outside to breathe, which was exactly how it needed to look. Downstairs the restaurant was busy, coats and laughter and the smell of roasted meat. The host met Eddie with a look that asked if everything was fine. Eddie gave the calm nod that answered yes, and also, please do not invent questions. At the door, the cold hit like a clean hand on the face. Outside, the street was alive. People in hats and scarves moved in bright little clusters. Car horns complained. Somewhere, a couple argued lovingly about directions. A few kids ran past with paper party favors, already celebrating as if midnight had arrived earlied. The small group headed toward the church a short walk away, one that held the neighborhood in its quiet orbit. The building was dark inside but lit by a few candles near the front, because faith did not need a big show in a place like this. The steps were dusted with snow. A faint bell sound lingered like a memory. They did not go in as a parade. They approached like neighbors. Eddie liked that. He preferred rituals that did not require an audience. At the church steps, a priest stood near the door speaking with a couple of older women, all of them wrapped in coats and patience. The priest nodded politely as the men arrived. No dramatic greetings, no stares, just acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge someone you have known for decades and do not need to rehearse. One of the older men touched the brim of his hat. Father. The priest offered a small smile. It is late for you to be outside, Antonio. Antonio replied with mild sarcasm. The city does not allow early nights on nights like this. The priest nodded, accepting that truth without judging it out loud. The priest looked briefly at Eddie, eyes steady. Eddie dipped his head. Respect was a language everyone spoke here. They stood on the steps for a moment, letting the cold clear their lungs. The street noise faded slightly, muffled by the church walls and the falling snow. For a few breaths, the city sounded like it was sleeping. Frankie stood beside Eddie, hands clasped behind his back, posture calm. He looked less like a host now and more like a man who had once been a boy on this same street, brought here by an aunt in a good coat. A soft moment of guilt moved through Eddie, not sharp, not punishing, just present. The softer kind of guilt was the kind that made you remember you were human. It made you remember family dinners and old promises, and the ways people tried to do right and failed in quiet ways. Eddie did not share those thoughts. He simply stood, letting the moment exist without grabbing it. One of the older men spoke quietly. Another year. Frankie answered with gentle steadiness. Another year. We are still here. A second older man huffed a small laugh. The city survived. That is something. Antonio glanced at Frankie. And you, still throwing parties like you are running for office. Frankie smiled. I throw parties so nobody throws chairs. Antonio nodded slowly, almost approving. Good reason. A younger man, standing slightly behind, shifted impatiently, hands in pockets. The cold was making him restless. Eddie noticed and stepped closer, Not to scold, just to anchor. The younger man leaned toward Eddie. Why we out here? Eddie kept his voice low and calm. Because the old men like to look at the church and pretend they are still boys for a minute. It makes them kinder upstairs. The younger man looked confused, then thoughtful. Huh, Eddie added. Also, the cold keeps people from getting too comfortable. Comfort makes people careless. The younger man nodded like he understood, even if he did not. From across the street, a figure paused under a street lamp. A woman in a neat coat, hat low, notebook tucked close. Millie Kerrigan. She did not approach. She simply watched, framed by snow and lamplight, like she was collecting atmosphere. Eddie felt his shoulders tighten slightly. Not fear, annoyance. The night was already full of eyes. Millie raised her chin a fraction in a silent greeting, then wrote something down and moved on. No chasing, no pushing, just recording. Frankie noticed too. His expression stayed calm, but his gaze followed her for a moment before returning to the church door. The priest cleared his throat gently, a sound like a reminder. Midnight is close. Antonio nodded. We know. We are only borrowing a minute. The priest smiled faintly. Borrow what you need. Return it quietly. They stood another moment, then Frankie made the smallest gesture. Time. They turned back toward the restaurant. The walk was short, but it felt useful. Air in the lungs, snow on the coat, a fresh start on the moods. Eddie watched the older men. Their steps looked lighter. Not much lighter, but enough. Halfway back, a man stepped out from a doorway and almost collided with them. He was not from the neighborhood. His coat was too new. His hat sat too stiff. His face carried the restless look of someone who wanted to be noticed. Eddie recognized that look. It belonged to men who treated a holiday like a stage. The outsider paused and looked at the group, then glanced at Frankie like he was studying a painting. His mouth formed a smile that was too wide to be sincere. Evening, he offered, voice smooth. Cold night for a walk. Frankie kept his tone pleasant and neutral. Cold night for everything. The man laughed a little too loud. True. Listen, I hear you have a nice room upstairs. Eddie felt the temperature shift, not in the air but in the space between people. A random man asking about an upstairs room at this hour was not random. Antonio stared at him like the man was a fly that had landed on a clean plate. Frankie maintained calm. The city has many rooms. The outsider kept smiling. Of course. I just mean, people talk. People say you are doing New Year's proper. Eddie watched the man's hands. They stayed in his pockets. He was trying to appear relaxed. Relaxed would have been believable if his eyes were not so hungry. Frankie nodded slightly. We always try to do things properly. The outsider leaned in by a fraction. Well, I got friends. We are nearby. We would love to bring a toast. Show respect. The word arrived too quickly, like a man using it as a key he had not earned. Eddie stepped half a step closer, not in a threatening way, just enough to enter the conversation as an object the man had to account for. The outsider glanced at Eddie, eyebrows lifting. Who is this? Frankie answered evenly. A friend. Eddie offered the mildest smile. A friend who likes quiet. The outsider chuckled, as if quiet were adorable. Quiet is nice, sure, but New Year's, you know. People want a little excitement. Eddie replied with calm honesty. Excitement is what gets people in trouble. This neighborhood prefers calm. The outsider's smile thinned. Your neighborhood prefers to act like it decides what the city prefers. Antonio took a breath, and Eddie noticed the old man's jaw tighten. Eddie also noticed Frankie raise a hand slightly, a subtle signal to keep it smooth. Frankie spoke with gentle authority. Tonight is not an open house. If you want to send respects, you can do it another day, when it is not snowing and everyone is not tired. The outsider held Frankie's gaze for a beat too long, then let out a short laugh. All right, another day. Happy New Year. He stepped back into the doorway, disappearing as neatly as he had appeared. Eddie watched the dark doorway for a second, then returned his attention to Frankie. Frankie's face stayed pleasant, but his eyes had sharpened into focus. That was inconvenient. Eddie kept his tone low. That was probing. Antonio grumbled. That was rude. Frankie breathed out slowly. No drama, We go back. We let the room stay warm. They continued toward the restaurant. Eddie's mind moved through possibilities, cautious and quiet. The outsider was not necessarily dangerous, but he was definitely interested, and interest was the first domino. Back inside, warmth wrapped them again. The host opened the door quickly, relief in his eyes when he saw Frankie smiling and the older men calm. Eddie guided the group upstairs with the same steady pace, as if nothing at all had occurred. The room welcomed them back with music and murmured conversation. People glanced up, people smiled, the rhythm held. Rosa stood in the kitchen doorway upstairs, eyes narrowing at Eddie's coat. "You were outside." A quick breath. Rosa's gaze sharpened. "And?" A man outside asked about the room. Rosa made a small sound that was not quite a curse but wanted to be. Of course he did. The city does not let a quiet thing stay quiet. "Are we safe?" Eddie nodded. "We are steady." It was handled with manners. Rosa pointed with her towel like a judge. "Keep it that way. I am not cleaning up a mood tonight." Eddie returned to the dining room. Frankie took his place again, greeting guests like nothing had interrupted him. That was what good hosts did. They swallowed the rough moments and served the smooth ones. Eddie moved toward the bar and checked the champagne supply himself. The bottles stood ready, the flutes were clean, the tray for midnight was arranged with attention. Eddie adjusted that glass by an inch, because symmetry soothed people even when they did not know it. At the edge of the room, Detective Pike had appeared again, standing near the downstairs entrance with his coat still on. He did not look like a man hunting. He looked like a man verifying that his feet might survive the night. Eddie approached him carefully, not abruptly, just present. Pike glanced at Eddie, expression tired but not unkind. "I saw you outside by the church." Eddie nodded. "A quick tradition." Pike exhaled. "Tradition is what keeps the city from turning into a zoo. Mostly." Eddie kept his voice low. A man also asked about the room. "Outside. Not from here." Pike's eyes sharpened slightly. "Description." Eddie gave it calmly. "Too new coat, too stiff hat, smile hungry, wanted to bring friends for a toast." Pike made a short sound like a man adding another pebble to a heavy pocket. "That is the kind that looks for a door to push on. You keep it closed." Eddie nodded. "It is closed." Pike shifted his weight. "Reporter is still out there too. She has been circling like she is looking for the cleanest angle." Eddie replied honestly. "I saw her." She wrote and moved on. Pike nodded, then let a mild humour enter his voice. "She is polite for trouble." Eddie almost smiled. "That is accurate." Pike's gaze moved across the room. "You keeping it calm? That is the job." Pike gave a small nod, almost respectful. "Good. Keep it that way until midnight. After midnight, people get feelings. Feelings are messy." Eddie watched a nearby table where two men laughed softly at a joke that did not matter. Feelings are already here. They are just wearing suits. Pike's mouth twitched. "Fair." "Happy New Year, Eddie." "Happy New Year, Detective." Pike stepped back toward the stairs again, fading into the background, which was where he seemed happiest. Eddie returned to his circuit. He checked staff, he checked pacing, he checked who had refills too quickly. He suggested more water on tables in a way that sounded like hospitality, not control. He reminded the bar quietly that slow was smooth and smooth was safe. As the minutes narrowed toward midnight, the room grew softer. Conversations turned reflective. Laughs grew warmer. A few men looked toward the ceiling as if expecting the new year to arrive through it. The musicians shifted into a familiar tune, gentle and nostalgic, the kind that made people remember themselves at younger ages. Artie played with restraint, letting the piano speak without getting dramatic. The clarinet floated on top, tender and clean. Frankie stepped toward the center of the room and raised his glass slightly. Not yet the midnight toast, just a prelude. Attention gathered without being forced. Frankie's voice was warm and calm, low enough that the room leaned in. "We are close. I will not make speeches. Nobody likes speeches. I only want to say this. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying respectful. And if the new year tries to act wild, we will act calmer than it." There were quiet chuckles and nods, relief in simple words. Eddie watched faces. Some looked touched. Some looked guarded. Some looked tired. Tired was good. Tired meant less drama. Frankie lowered his glass and moved back to the bar area where the midnight tray waited. Eddie followed, ready to help with the mechanical part of the moment, because moments were safer when the logistics were flawless. Outside, a distant roar rose from the city, a wave of sound building as Times Square and 100 other corners wound themselves up. Inside, the room stayed quieter, as if the neighborhood wanted the new year to arrive politely at the door, knock, and wait to be invited. Eddie checked the clock again. Minutes now. He touched his second notebook in his pocket, not to write, just to remind himself that the night could be recorded and therefore controlled. It was a small superstition, but Eddie allowed small superstitions. The city ran on them. He looked toward the door, toward the stairwell, toward the windows where snow kept falling like a slow curtain. The new year was approaching. The room was steady, the men were calm, the champagne was ready, and Eddie, for the first time all evening, believed they might make it to midnight without anyone trying to turn feelings into trouble. Chapter 7. The reporter gets too close, politely. The room had reached that late-hour softness where people began speaking as if their words were fragile. Not whispered, not secretive, just careful. It was the same tone you heard at the end of a long family dinner, when the plates were mostly clear and the stories were mostly repeats and nobody wanted to be the one to break the mood. Eddie moved through the tables with a steady pace, his attention split between a dozen small details. A water glass here, an empty bread plate there, a guest shifting in his chair like he was about to stand too fast, a waiter hesitating in a doorway because he felt watched. All of it mattered, because a calm room was not a natural thing. It was built, it was maintained, it was protected. Near the stage, Artie and the trio kept the music at the perfect temperature, warm enough to relax shoulders, quiet enough to let conversation stay private, steady enough to prevent silence from forming sharp thoughts. When the clarinet floated above the piano, the sound had the gentle confidence of someone saying everything will be fine and believing it. Frankie remained the center without acting like the center. He knew how to be visible without being demanding. When he laughed, others relaxed. When he lowered his voice, others lowered theirs. When he walked past a table, men sat a little straighter without resenting it. Frankie made the room behave by making it want to behave, and then the door downstairs became interesting. Eddie felt it before he heard it. The air changed slightly, the way it changed when someone opened a window in winter. A faint draft of attention moved through the stairwell. The host downstairs spoke, then spoke again, a touch more formal the second time. Shoes on the stairs, not rushing, not casual, deliberate. Eddie drifted toward the top of the stairs and paused where he could see without being seen too clearly. The policy for nights like this was simple. Do not create a scene. Prevent scenes from creating themselves. A woman appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Neat coat, hat angled cleanly, notebook held close like it was part of her hand. Millie Kerrigan looked up the stairwell and let her eyes take in the breathing of the building. She did not look nervous, she looked prepared. The host stood near her shoulder, slightly tense, doing his best to appear like he made decisions in his own building. That was an exhausting performance for a restaurant host on New Year's Eve. Millie's voice rose gently, polite and cleared. She was explaining something. Eddie could not hear the words, but he could hear the tone. Friendly, reasonable, almost charming, the most dangerous kind. Eddie stepped down the stairs just enough to enter when he wanted to, then stopped again. He let her see him first. He preferred to control the timing of introductions. Millie noticed him and offered a small, bright smile, the smile of a person who believed smiles open doors. "Good evening, Mr. DeParlo. Fancy meeting you again." Eddie kept his posture calm and his face neutral, then added just enough humor to keep the air soft. New York is small if you stand in the same places long enough. Millie nodded as if she agreed, then angled her body slightly, indicating she was not here to argue, only to cooperate. "I was downstairs having coffee. I saw the music list on the ward. It made me curious. Soft swing, a piano, warm songs. It sounded like the kind of New Year's I could actually survive." Eddie glanced toward the host, whose eyes looked grateful that Eddie had stepped in. Eddie returned his attention to Millie. Coffee turns into curiosity quickly. Millie tapped the notebook lightly against her coat, not aggressive, just present. I am writing a small piece, not an exposé, not a hunt. A human story about the city choosing gentleness for night. Your neighborhood does gentleness better than most. That is all I want. Eddie knew that reporters often believed their own intentions. He also knew intentions did not control outcomes. A polite paragraph could become a loud headline after an editor touched it. A harmless detail could become an address. A warm sentence could become a spotlight, and spotlights made people behave strangely. Eddie kept his voice low and even. If you want gentleness, you can get it without going upstairs. Millie lifted her eyebrows, amused. I was hoping you would say that. And I was hoping you would also understand that sometimes the gentlest stories happen behind doors. Eddie held the pause. He did not like the idea of a reporter upstairs, even if she was polite and even if the room was behaving. The room was behaving partly because it believed it was private. At the same time, Eddie remembered the scarf man on the docks and the favour that had brought the champagne back. Keep her on bread and snow, do not let her chew on names. Eddie also remembered Pike's tired feet and his request for a quiet night. Eddie chose the middle path again, because middle paths were how you moved through crowded rooms without spill and acid. He stepped down more stair, meeting Millie at a point where she could not claim she had been invited upstairs, but also could not claim she had been shoved out the door. It was a hallway conversation, neither inside nor outside, a conversation that could end cleanly. Millie, he began in a calm tone that treated her like a person, not an enemy, I believe you when you say you want a gentle story. But this building is full of people who want a gentle year. They have chosen a room without windows for a reason. Millie's smile softened. You think I will harm them? Eddie shook his head slightly. I think the paper harms people without meaning to. It is like snow. It falls lightly, then it turns into slush, and everyone pretends they did not see it coming. Millie let out a quiet laugh, then considered him with those bright eyes that noticed everything. That is a good line. Eddie did not smile at the compliment. Lines were not the goal tonight. Calm was. Millie adjusted her grip on the notebook. All right, no windows, no names. But help me. Give me the warmth from upstairs without the details that make it dangerous. That is a fair trade. Eddie watched her for a beat. She was pushing, but she was also offering a boundary in her own way. She was showing him the edge of what she truly wanted. Not a scandal, a scene, a texture, a sense of New York choosing restraint for once. Eddie could work with texture. He nodded once. Fine. You stay downstairs. You do not go up. You do not speak to guests. You do not print an address. You do not print names. And you do not print anything about what you think is happening. Only what you actually see and smell and hear. Millie's eyes brightened, pleased by the clarity. Deal, Eddie continued, careful. And what you see and smell and hear comes from me, not from wandering around. You get a guided version, a safe version. Millie made a thoughtful expression, then nodded. A guided tour of gentleness. I can live with that. The host exhaled quietly behind her, relief mixing with confusion because he had expected shouting, and instead got negotiation. Eddie led Millie 2 steps toward the side of the downstairs bar area, away from the stairs. He chose a small table near a wall where they could speak without attracting attention. The restaurant downstairs was busy with regular customers and holiday wanderers. Nobody cared about what woman with a notebook. New York had seen stranger things before appetizers. Millie sat with good posture, pen ready, eyes attentive. She looked like a student who had found the right teacher. Eddie did not love that feeling. He began with harmless truth. Upstairs, the room is lit softly, not dark, not secretive, just soft, like the room wants people to remember they have manners. Millie wrote, her pen moving fast and neat. Soft lighting, manners, good. There is a piano on a small stage, Eddie continued, and the piano sounds tired in a good way, like it has heard too many years end and still shows up to help. Millie paused and looked up, smiling. That is beautiful, Eddie replied dryly. Do not make it too beautiful. The piano would hate that. Millie laughed quietly and wrote again. Eddie went on. There is also a trio, 2 strings and a clarinet. They play like they are cushioning the edges of conversations. Nobody has to raise their voice. Millie nodded. So it is not a roaring party. It is a slow one. It is a controlled one, Eddie corrected gently. Some people go to New Year's for excitement. Some people go to New Year's for reassurance. Millie underlined that with her pen, then asked softly and carefully, "What kind of people?" Eddie gave her a look that was not harsh, just firm. People, neighbours, men with long memories, women who would scold them if they behaved badly, old friends, new friends. It is not a carnival. It is dinner. Millie nodded, accepting the boundary. Dinner. Food. What food? Eddie almost smiled, because food was safer than names and also more interesting than names. A lot. There is a woman in the kitchen who runs the room the way the law should run the city. She has an apron and the power to silence grown men by lifting gone eyebrow. Millie's eyes lit up. That sounds like someone I want to meet. Eddie shook his head slightly. You do not. She will adopt you and then criticize your shoes. Millie laughed again, and her laugh stayed quiet, considerate of the room around them. What does she cook? Eddie offered a quick stream of sensory detail, the kind that could not get anyone arrested but could make a reader hungry. Garlic in the air, sauce that smells like warmth, roasted meat, bread arriving in steady waves so nobody feels ignored, pastries brought by older women who treat sugar like it is a serious ingredient with moral obligations. Millie wrote quickly, and her face softened with the pleasure of getting what she wanted, not a secret, but a real scene. Then she asked the question Eddie knew would arrive eventually, even if she had promised no names, and the host upstairs. The one who wants it gentle. What is he like? Eddie felt the pressure of that. Frankie's name could not enter this notebook, not tonight. He chose a true description without the key detail. The host is the kind of man who believes charm is a service. He greets people like he is grateful they came, even when he is the one doing the favor by hosting. He tells jokes before anyone can make a sharp comment. He makes the room smoother by smoothing himself first. Millie looked up, eyebrows raised. That is a very specific kind of man. New York produces certain types, Eddie replied. This one of them. Millie tapped her pen thoughtfully. Could I call him the gentleman host? Eddie paused. The phrase was not a name, and also not a lie. It was vague enough to be safe, and it would satisfy her craving for a focal point. You can call him that, Eddie allowed, but you do not describe his face, you do not describe the building, you do not mention the street number. You keep it atmospheric. Millie made a small salute with her pen. Atmospheric. Understood. She looked at him for a moment longer than a reporter needed to, and Eddie recognized the look. It was curiosity, but also a kind of respect. You are not what people expect, Millie murmured. Eddie kept his tone steady. People expect a lot of nonsense. I try to disappoint them. Millie smiled. You have a reputation, you know. Eddie responded with mild sarcasm. I am thrilled, she continued quietly. Some people say you are dangerous because you know too much. Some people say you are harmless because you look tired. I think you are dangerous because you look tired. Eddie exhaled slowly. That was almost a compliment and almost an accusation. He chose the safest reply. I look tired because I keep other people from doing foolish things. Millie nodded as if that was the center of her story. A man keeping foolishness out of the room. That is a New York story. Eddie kept his voice calm but firm. It is also a story you write without names. Millie held his gaze and nodded once, serious now, without names. A brief silence settled between them, comfortable enough, and in that silence Eddie noticed something. Millie was not hunting like a wuss. She was hunting like a person who believed stories could fix the world. That belief could still cause trouble, but trouble with good intentions was sometimes easier to negotiate with than trouble with bad ones. Eddie leaned back slightly. You want one more detail for your atmosphere? Millie's eyes brightened. Yes. Tell them about the glasses, Eddie offered. Millie blinked. The glasses. Eddie nodded. The room has good glassware, clean, carefully placed. People drink from it like they are trying to be civilized, and for one night, They succeed. Millie wrote it down and then she looked up amused. That is not the detail I expected you to give me. Eddie kept his tone dry. It is a safe detail. Glass does not sue, glass does not call the paper, glass does not develop opinions. Millie laughed softly again. And the midnight toast, will you describe it for me? Eddie considered. Midnight was minutes away. Describing it in advance was arrogant, but describing the plan was harmless. The host will raise a glass, Eddie explained. He will say something short, nobody will make speeches, then everyone will drink, some will smile, some will pretend not to feel anything, some will feel too much and sit very still. The music will keep it from turning heavy. Millie wrote, then paused. And you, what will you do at midnight? Eddie did not immediately answer. That question was too personal for a notebook that belonged to a newspaper. But it was also a human question, and Eddie had agreed to give her human colour. He chose a small truth. I will count glasses. I will watch faces. I will make sure nobody stands up too fast. Millie's smile softened. You will protect the year turning. Eddie replied, calm and plain. If the year wants to turn politely, I will hold the door. Millie wrote that line carefully and Eddie knew she would use it. It was not a name, it was not a location, it was a feeling. A good editor would love it, which made Eddie slightly nervous, but he accepted it because it was still safe. Footsteps approached. Detective Pike appeared at the edge of the downstairs bar area, coat on, eyes tired. He noticed Millie and his expression shifted into mild resignation, the look of a man seeing a familiar inconvenience. Millie looked up and met Pike's gaze with polite cheer, like this was all perfectly normal. Detective, Pike nodded, cautious. Miss Kerrigan? Eddie watched both of them. Pike looked like he wanted to go back out into the snow and argue with traffic instead. Millie looked delighted to have a recognizable figure in her orbit. Pike glanced at Eddie, then at the notebook. She behaving. Eddie answered evenly. She is staying downstairs. She is writing about bread and snow and music. Millie lifted her eyebrows, amused. I am writing about gentle New York. Believe it or not, detective. Pike sighed. I will believe it when I read it without needing aspirin. Millie smiled. I will keep it kind. Pike looked at Eddie again, and Eddie read the silent question, will this stay quiet? Eddie answered with a small nod. Yes. Pike's shoulders loosened slightly. Good. Then he offered the closest thing to a blessing he was likely to give. Do your piece, but do not turn it into a map. Millie nodded once, serious. I will not. Pike turned to leave, then paused and added, almost reluctantly, Happy New Year. Millie responded warmly. Happy New Year, detective. Pike disappeared again, swallowed by the restaurant crowd and the city beyond it. Millie watched him go, then turned back to Eddie, pen poised. You are doing something interesting tonight, Eddie corrected gently. I am doing something boring on purpose. Millie gave a quiet laugh, then closed her notebook halfway, a sign of good faith. All right, I have enough. I will write it clean. I will not attach names. I will not attach street numbers. I will not attach a spotlight. I will attach warmth. Eddie held her gaze. And you will not try to go upstairs. Millie lifted her palm slightly. No upstairs. Eddie nodded. Good. Then do me one more kindness. Do not wait outside at midnight. Do not take notes about faces through windows. Let them have one private minute. Millie hesitated, then nodded. Fair. I can take my midnight on the street like everyone else. Eddie stood. Then we are done. Millie stood too, smoothing her coat. Before you go, Mr. DeParlo, one last thing. If the city decides to be cruel next year, what do you do? Eddie considered the question, the softness of it, how it could be a line in a newspaper, and also an honest inquiry. He gave her a simple answer that did not expose anything, and also did not lie. You do the small work, he replied. You keep the room warm. You keep the chairs straight. You keep the bread coming. You keep people from turning their feelings into mistakes. Millie's eyes were bright as she wrote the last phrase. Small work. Warm room. Bread. Chairs. That is not the kind of crime story people expect. Eddie gave her a tired smile. Most of the city is not a crime story. Most of the city is just trying to get to morning. Millie tucked her notebook away. "Happy New Year, Eddie Two Notebooks," Eddie answered calmly. "Happy New Year, Millie Kerrigan. Keep it gentle." She walked away into the restaurant crowd without lingering, and Eddie appreciated that more than he would ever admit. He returned to the stairs and headed back up, feeling the time press closer. Midnight was now very near, and the room upstairs would soon need all of his attention. As he reached the top landing, the music floated toward him like reassurance. The light was still soft, the conversations were still low, the champagne glasses were lined up, waiting. Eddie took his place near the bar, checked the tray one last time, and let himself believe one simple thing. If the new year wanted to arrive quietly, this room was ready to invite it in. Chapter 8. The Detective Who Just Wants the City to Behave. Detective Harold Pike had spent most of the evening negotiating with noise. The city produced noise the way a furnace produced heat. It did not take a holiday. It did not take a hint. It simply kept going until morning, and then it acted surprised when people looked tired. He started his shift at a desk that smelled like old coffee and newer regret, then moved out into streets that smelled like wet wool and cold metal and cheap perfume. New Year's Eve always brought out the same parade of minor disasters. Couples arguing with affectionate fury, drunks announcing their poetry to strangers, taxi drivers complaining about pedestrians, pedestrians complaining about existence, everyone treating the calendar like it was a judge and a priest at the same time. Pike did not hate the holiday. He thought it was a little dramatic. He preferred celebrations that did not require shouting at the sky, but he understood why people did it. The year ended and people wanted to pretend they had some influence over the next house. It was a human habit, and Pike had learned that human habits were never fully logical. They were just consistent. The trouble was that human habits also created paperwork. He spent the first part of the night walking through midtown crowd edges, not inside the thickest crush, because you did not walk into a river. You watched the river and guided it away from breaking its banks. He redirected a lost tourist with a map that looked like it had been folded angrily. He separated two men who were arguing about a hat like it was a constitutional issue. He told a street vendor to stop putting his cart in the middle of a crosswalk, less because it was illegal and more because it was rude. By the time the city clocks leaned toward midnight, Pike felt the ache in his feet that always arrived on holidays, an ache that started in the soles and climbed into the bones like it was buying property. He took a breath, looked south, and made the same choice he made every year. He went to the neighborhoods where trouble either began or tried to hide. Tonight, for him, that meant Little Italy. Not because he expected fireworks, he expected the opposite. The best kind of problem was the one that stayed asleep. Pike had learned that calmer rooms could still produce sharp moments when pride got lonely, and Little Italy had a special talent for pride, delivered politely with a napkin. He walked into the restaurant on Mulberry Street where he had already drifted earlier, the web with the upstairs room that always sounded quieter than the city deserved. The host recognized him instantly and tried to look calm about it, which Pike appreciated. Nothing was worse than a host who treated a detective like a theatrical event. The downstairs room was busy with ordinary diners, coats piled on chairbacks, laughter floating above plates, forks tapping glass. Pike could have stayed there and let the warmth do its job on his feet, but he had a reason to be there, and his feet did not get to vote. He saw Eddie DeParlo near the stairs, moving with that steady pace Pike had come to associate with quiet control. Eddie had the posture of a man who did not want to attract attention, and still attracted it, mainly because he looked like someone who was always listening. Listening was suspicious in a city full of people trying not to know things. Pike approached without drama. Eddie noticed him and angled his body slightly, polite and cautious. Pike kept his voice low. "You are still keeping it calm." Eddie gave a small nod. "The room is steady." Pike glanced toward the upstairs. The music drifted down faintly, soft swing and piano, the kind of sound that made a room feel like it had manners. Pike felt his shoulders loosen by a fraction. Music like that did not start fights. Music like that prevented them. Pike continued, tone practical. I do not want trouble in this neighborhood tonight. Note because I am sentimental, because my feet are tired, and because the city has enough noise already. Eddie did not smile. Eddie rarely smiled at detectives, which Pike respected. Eddie replied evenly, "Calm is the goal." Good. Pike let his gaze move across the downstairs room. Reporter is still circling. Eddie nodded. She stayed downstairs earlier. She left with bread and atmosphere. Pike exhaled. Bread and atmosphere is better than names and roots. Eddie replied with mild dryness. That is about as good as a reporter gets on a holiday. Pike almost smiled. Almost. Then he caught a small shift in the room near the entrance. Two men entered and paused as if they were feeling the air for weakness. Their coats were not especially fancy, but their posture was too confident for ordinary diners. They looked around, not for a table but for attention. Pike turned his head slightly so only Eddie could hear. "You expecting guests?" Eddie stayed calm. "Upstairs guests, yes. Downstairs, no." One of the newcomers spoke to the host with a smile that did not match his eyes. The host answered politely. The two men lingered, not leaving, not sitting. Lingering was always a clue. People who belonged somewhere did not linger like they were waiting for permission from the universe. Pike watched them without staring. One of them had the restless posture of a man who wanted to be noticed. He shifted weight, glanced toward the stairs, then glanced at Pike, then looked away too quickly. The other man murmured something to him, and the restless one made a small, frustrated gesture with his hand. Pike saw it clearly. The gesture was not violent, it was impatient, like a man tapping a pencil. But impatience was how trouble introduced itself. Pike leaned closer to Eddie. "That pair is looking for an upstairs door." Eddie kept his tone low. "There was a man earlier outside who asked about the room, too smooth, too eager." Pike nodded. "That is how it starts. Somebody tests the door. If the door moves, they push harder." Eddie tilted his head slightly. "The door is not moving." Pike appreciated the confidence. He also knew confidence could be expensive. He made a choice and stepped toward the two men, not like a storm, more like a man going to ask for directions. "Evening." Pike kept the word friendly. He wanted friendly. Friendly prevented theatre. The restless looked him over, then tried to smile like it was casual. "Evening." Pike nodded toward the host stand. "You looking for a table?" The man shrugged. "Maybe. Just checking the place." Pike kept his voice calm. "It is a good place. Food is solid, service is steady. Upstairs is private." The restless man blinked. "Upstairs is private." Pike nodded slowly. "Private is a beautiful concept. It keeps people from making mistakes in public." The second man, quieter, tried to steer the situation away. "We are not making mistakes. We are just celebrating. It is New Year's." Pike gave him a look that held mild humor and mild certainty. "Everybody is just celebrating until they are not. Where you headed tonight?" The restless man hesitated. Then he chose a vague answer. "Around." Pike replied gently. "Around is a lot of city. My advice is you stay in spaces that want you. The city is full of them tonight. No need to wander into rooms that do not." The restless man's smile tightened. "You telling us to leave?" Pike nodded. "Yes, I am." The man looked like he wanted to protest. Then he noticed Pike's tired eyes and the fact that tired eyes still meant consequences. He huffed a short laugh. The kind of laugh people used when they wanted to pretend they were not being corrected. "Fine. Happy New Year, detective. Happy New Year." Pike kept his tone polite. "Go do it somewhere else." The two men left the restaurant with the reluctant pace of people walking away from a door they hoped might open later. Pike watched them go through the window. They stopped briefly outside, spoke near the curb, then moved on into the crowd. Pike turned back toward Eddie. "That should hold for now." Eddie gave a small nod of appreciation. "Thank you." Pike shrugged slightly. "I am not doing it for you. I am doing it for tomorrow morning." Eddie replied evenly. "Tomorrow morning is underrated." Pike let the humor sit for a second, then glanced at the stairs again. "How close to midnight?" Eddie answered. "Close enough that everyone starts thinking the clock has feelings." Pike grunted. "That is when trouble likes to try again. It waits until people are soft." Eddie's gaze shifted briefly to the dining room. The soft waiter, the soft music, the soft lighting. Eddie's whole job had been softness, applied like a balm to a room full of hard edges. Eddie spoke quietly. Upstairs is steady, but there is always a chance someone outside wants to be remembered. Pike nodded, and some people cannot handle being forgotten. The noise outside grew by a degree as the city built toward its midnight moment. Pike felt it even through the restaurant walls like distant thunder. He held the calm inside his chest as long as he could, because calm was contagious if you carried it firmly. He made his way out again into the street, walking slow enough to look casual, fast enough to feel useful. Snow still fell in fine grains. Streetlights turned it into a faint glitter that made even gutters look slightly romantic. Pike did not trust romance. Romance was how people excused bad decisions. He walked the block, scanning. He saw Millie Kerrigan near a doorway, notebook tucked away, arms folded for warmth. She looked up and spotted him. Her face brightened, which Pike found irritating in a polite way. "Detective?" Her tone was cheerful. "Miss Kerrigan." Pike kept it neutral. "You still writing about bread and snow?" Millie smiled. "Bread and snow and a bit of gentle music." "The city has softer corners if you know where to look." Pike nodded. "Keep your corners soft. Do not turn them into addresses." Millie's expression sobered briefly. "I will not, I promised." Pike believed she meant it. Meaning it, however, was only half the job. The other half was editors. Pike glanced up the street. "You staying out of the upstairs room?" "Mm-hmm." She nodded. "No upstairs." "Good." Pike looked at the crowd edges and caught movement near the corner. A man was standing by a lamppost, coat open despite the cold, face flushed, expression loud even before he spoke. The man's hands moved in wide gestures as he talked to someone who had already begun backing away. The man was not local. Pike did not recognize him as neighborhood stock. His posture had that unstable buoyancy of drink, the kind that made people brave and clumsy at the same time. Brave and clumsy was a dangerous combination near private rooms. Pike watched as the man turned, spotted the restaurant and started walking toward it with purpose that did not belong to him. Pike could almost hear the future paperwork being drafted. Pike stepped into the man's path calmly. "Evening." Pike kept his tone friendly. "You doing all right?" The man stared at him for a moment, eyes unfocused, then grinned as if Pike were a buddy he had forgotten. "Doing great. Best night, best city, best year." Pike nodded. "Wonderful. Where you headed?" The man pointed toward the restaurant. "In there. I heard there is a party upstairs. Fancy. Private. I got a message. Somebody owes me a toast." Pike felt the familiar sigh in his chest. "Owes me a toast" was the drunk version of "I want to start something and call it tradition." Pike kept his posture relaxed. Private rooms stay private. You can toast outdoors like the rest of the city. The man frowned, the grin evaporating into irritation. "Who says?" Pike kept the tone calm. "I do. Also the door does." The man leaned forward, breath sharp with alcohol and anger. "You a cop?" Pike nodded. "Yes." The man's shoulders set as if preparing for a speech. "Listen, detective. I got a right to celebrate. I got a right to go where I want. I got a right to walk up those stairs and look a man in the eyes. This year has been disrespectful to me." Pike almost smiled at the phrasing. "The year has been disrespectful to me" was the kind of sentence that should be written on a greeting card for men who liked trouble. Pike kept it gentle. "The year has been disrespectful to everybody. That is why we are all trying to be polite for night. Help the city out." The man blinked, confused by the request for cooperation. "I am polite." Pike nodded. "Great. Then you will be polite somewhere else." The man's irritation rose. He tried to step around Pike. Pike did not grab him. He simply shifted, blocking the path with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned the power of standing still. The man stopped short, offended, then looked up and noticed Eddie near the restaurant doorway, watching with calm attention. Eddie had stepped out when he noticed Pike speaking to the man. He stayed a few feet back, not rushing in, letting Pike try softness first. Pike appreciated that. Too many people intervened by shouting, and shouting was how you invited a crowd. The drunk man pointed at Eddie. "Who is that?" That the guy who thinks he is better than me. Eddie's voice stayed calm and even. I do not know you. That made the drunk man angrier. Exactly, you do not know me. That is disrespect. I was here before, years ago. I had friends. We did business. Then the city forgets you. Then you walk past and you see lights upstairs and you think, maybe they remember. Maybe they owe you. Pike heard the real thing beneath the noise, loneliness, wounded pride. A man whose life had drifted and left him behind, now trying to attach himself to a moment because moments made people feel anchored. Pike kept his tone low. Nobody owes you a room tonight, but you can have a coffee, warm up, sit down, let the year end without you doing something you hate tomorrow. The man hesitated. Coffee. Eddie stepped forward slightly, offering support without escalating. Coffee is good, and there is bread. Bread is safer than stairs. The drunk man stared, trying to decide whether he was being insulted. Then his face softened in a small, embarrassed way. The way faces softened when kindness arrived where they expected a fight. A gust of wind hit, and the man shivered hard. His bravado flickered. Cold had a way of cutting through stories. Pike used the opening. Come on, we will get you coffee. Then you can go shout at Times Square like everyone else. The man let out a short laugh that sounded like defeat. Times Square is full of idiots. Pike nodded. Yes, that is why you will fit in fine. Millie, still nearby, watched with bright eyes, but she kept her notebook away. Good. Eddie's earlier request had landed. Pike appreciated that too. The drunk man followed Pike and Eddie inside. The restaurant warmth hit him, and he sagged slightly like a man realizing he had been carrying his anger mostly for insulation. The host looked alarmed for a second, then saw Pike and relaxed. Pike guided the man to a small table in the corner, away from the stairs, away from eyes. Eddie asked the bartender for coffee and bread quietly, and the bartender provided it without fuss, because the bartender knew when a problem was being calmly dismantled. Pike sat across from the man, coat still on, hands relaxed. Coffee arrived. Bread arrived. The man stared at the cup as if it were a small miracle. Pike spoke softly. What is your name? The man hesitated, then offered it. Frankie Russo. Not Frankie the host, a different Frankie. Less polished and more lost. Pike nodded as if the name mattered. Because it did to the man. Frankie, you do not want to go upstairs tonight. Russo looked up, eyes wet but controlled. I just wanted them to remember. Eddie kept his voice gentle. People remember more than they say, but they have to choose when to show it. Tonight is delicate. Russo swallowed. Delicate. Yeah. I am not delicate, Pike replied, practical and kind. You can be delicate for 10 minutes, then you can go be tough somewhere harmless. Russo snorted softly. Tough somewhere harmless. That is funny. Eddie offered a small smile. Most toughness is harmless. That is the secret. Russo ate bread slowly, hands trembling less. Coffee warmed him from the inside out. The colour returned to his cheeks, less angry and more embarrassed. He glanced toward the stairs once, then looked away like a man turning from a temptation. Pike felt the moment settle. The outside threat was dissolving into a man with crumbs on his lip and regret in his eyes. Pike had seen this many times. People did not always want trouble. Sometimes they wanted a reason not to make it. Pike leaned back slightly. When you finish that coffee, you go outside and you join the crowd. You do your countdown, you clap, you go home. You wake up tomorrow and you pretend this never happened. That is a gift I'm giving you. Russo nodded slowly. Thank you, Eddie added quietly. And if you want people to remember you, you start by remembering yourself tomorrow morning. Eat breakfast. Call someone you trust. Do not make the year start with a bruise. Russo stared at Eddie for a moment, then nodded again, more firmly. Yeah. Okay. Millie walked past the corner, glanced at the table, and kept going. No notes, no headlines, just a small human moment staying small. Pike felt a faint satisfaction, the kind he usually felt only when a city bus arrived on time. Eddie stood. I will check upstairs. Make sure the room stays steady. Pike nodded. Go. Eddie moved up the stairs quietly, vanishing back into the soft music and lamplight. Pike stayed for a few minutes, letting Rousseau finish his coffee. Rousseau's posture softened, anger drained away, replaced by tiredness. Tiredness was a decent outcome. Tired people made fewer speeches. Once the cup was empty, Pike stood. Time. Rousseau pulled on his gloves. Yeah. They walked outside together. The street noise hit them again, louder now, the city about to burst into its midnight roar. Rousseau paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the street lights and snow like he had forgotten they could be pretty. "Happy New Year, Detective," Rousseau muttered. Pike nodded. "Happy New Year, go do it quietly." Rousseau shuffled into the crowd and disappeared among hats and scarves and laughter. Pike watched him go, then turned toward the restaurant doorway. Eddie stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, visible through the open angle, checking the room like a man checking the weather. Eddie looked down and met Pike's gaze briefly. Pike lifted his chin in a small salute. Eddie returned a small nod. The city outside surged louder. Midnight was close enough that the street itself seemed to hold its breath. Pike felt the ache in his feet again, but he also felt something lighter. For when night, the city might manage to cross from one year into the next, without leaving broken pride on the sidewalk. He turned and walked toward the next corner, because corners were where the city tested itself. He did not hurry. He simply kept moving, steady as a metronome, listening for the first crack in the night. Behind him, upstairs, the soft music continued. The champagne waited. The room stayed calm, and Pike, for the first time that night, believed the neighborhood might make it to midnight without becoming a headline. Chapter 9. The Countdown, the Toast, the Almost Mistake. Upstairs, the room had reached the quiet edge of anticipation. The kind of anticipation that made people clean their throats and adjust their cuffs and pretend it was because they were comfortable. The music stayed warm and steady, but Eddie could feel the subtle tightening beneath it, like a ribbon being pulled gently into a bow. The last plates of the main course cleared. Dessert began to appear in careful waves. Cookies and pastries, small and glossy, set down with ceremony. Coffee arrived. Water was refilled. The waiters moved as if they were trying not to disturb the air itself. Eddie had positioned himself near the bar, close to the midnight tray, close to the champagne, close to Frankie, and close to the doors. It was a practical triangle, the kind he often stood in when a room needed a calm anchor. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, because hands that looked busy made other people feel busy. Busy hands created busy moods created problems. Frankie stood by the bar as well, receiving quiet compliments and offering softer jokes. His smile was still in place. His eyes, though, were working. Frankie watched faces the way Eddie watched chairs. Frankie watched pride and fatigue and nostalgia, measuring how close each guest was to getting sentimental in the wrong direction. Near the stage, Artie shifted into a familiar tune that carried gentle cheer without getting loud, and the trio followed. The clarinet floated above the piano in a warm line that made the room feel like it had a hearth, even though it was simply a dining hall above a restaurant and the only fire was the one inside people's opinions. The clock ticked toward midnight. A little before 12, the final set of guests arrived. Not many, but enough to shift the balance. These were the ones Frankie had invited from across the river. Not necessarily rivals, not necessarily friends, more like neighbors who smiled at each other from opposite sidewalks. Their arrival was polite, and their coats were brushed too carefully, and their shoes were clean in a way that suggested they did not walk much humor into their lives. They entered with calm confidence. Their smiles were smooth, their eyes were alert. They carried a gift basket wrapped neatly, and the basket itself felt like a statement. Gifts in rooms like that were rarely just gifts. They were reminders, proofs, invitations to obligation. Frankie greeted them warmly, and warmth spread like controlled fire. "Gentlemen, Happy New Year. Thank you for coming." The leader of the small group, a man with silver hair and a face that looked carved rather than grown, returned the greeting with equal polish. "Happy New Year. Always a pleasure." Eddie watched, evaluating. The man spoke with a calm voice. Calm voices could still carry sharp edges. Eddie saw the gift basket placed near the bar where everyone could see it. That was intentional. Public gifts were pressure disguised as generosity. Frankie introduced them around the room with careful consideration, never placing them too close to anyone who might bristle, never leaving them isolated enough to feel slighted. Eddie admired that. Seating was diplomacy in cloth and wood. Then Eddie noticed something else. One of the visiting men, a younger girl with narrow eyes, kept glancing toward the stage, not in appreciation, in calculation. He watched the musicians, then watched the room, then watched Frankie. It was the look of a man who enjoyed testing boundaries, not by pushing hard, but by placing a finger on the edge and seeing if it moved. Eddie made a mental note. Watch the narrow eyes, keep him distracted. The room absorbed the visitors. Conversation did not spike. No eyebrows lifted too dramatically. The warmth held, which was a small victory the room did not know it needed. Time narrowed. At 5 minutes to midnight, Frankie moved toward the bar and nodded to a waiter to begin arranging the champagne flutes on the tray. Eddie double-checked the count. Enough glasses, enough bottles, enough at hand to prevent stalling. Stalling was how awkwardness grew. The musicians shifted into something softer, a tune that felt like a hand on the shoulder. Artie kept the piano restrained, giving the room space to feel without drowning in it. Frankie lifted his glass slightly, a signal. The room's conversational volume lowered. Chairs stopped shifting. Forks stopped tapping. Everyone gave Frankie attention, because attention was easier than uncertainty. Frankie's voice was calm and grounded. Gentlemen, friends, thank you for being here. I will not make a speech. Nobody sleeps well after a speech. A few soft chuckles. Frankie continued, and his tone held the steady warmth of a man speaking at a family table. We made it through another year. Some years feel long, some feel short. This one felt like both. Tonight I only want to say this. May the next year arrive quietly for all of us. May it bring fewer surprises and better dinners, and may we all remember that manners are cheaper than regrets. The room murmured agreement. Even the visiting men nodded politely, because nodding cost nothing and looked good. Frankie lowered his glass slightly, waiting. The clock ticked down the final seconds. Someone near the window began counting softly. Others joined, voices low, as if louder counting might tempt the universe to misbehave. 10, 9, 8. Eddie watched hands. Some gripped glasses too tightly. Some held them lightly, as if holding time itself. 7, 6, 5. Eddie watched faces. Nostalgia softened a few, pride sharpened a few, fatigue dulled most. Fatigue was still his favorite ingredient. 4, 3, 2. The final second passed, and then the room crossed into the new year. 1. Outside, a distant roar rose through the city, Times Square and 100 other corners exploding into noise. Inside, the room did not roar. It breathed out, gentle and relieved. Happy New Year, Frankie said warmly, lifting his glass a little higher. Happy New Year, the room replied, a soft chorus. They drank. The champagne tasted like a promise. It bubbled on tongues, it warmed throats, it gave men permission to smile a little more openly. For a moment, the room looked almost like a normal gathering of neighbours, people with food and music and the faint hope that tomorrow would be kinder than today. Eddie let himself take a small sip too, a token. He did not want to be fully outside the moment. Fully outside moments made you feel colder. Then the almost mistake arrived. It began small. The younger visiting man with narrow eyes stepped closer to the stage, glass in hand, smile on his face that was just slightly too confident. He approached Artie and leaned in, speaking over the piano line. Artie kept playing, eyes on the keys, pretending he did not hear, which was often the best response to foolishness. The visiting man persisted, tapping the edge of the piano lightly with one finger. Eddie saw Artie's shoulders tighten. Artie did not like fingers on his piano. That piano was old and proud and remembered things. It did not need a stranger tapping it like a bar counter. The visiting man laughed softly, then spoke louder, a line meant for nearby ears. Come on, maestro, play something with life. It is the new year, give us something to remember. Eddie felt the temperature shift. Not much, but enough. A few heads turned. Men like Frankie's room did not appreciate unpredictability. Unpredictability made them calculate, and calculating made them suspicious. Artie's hands kept moving, but his jaw tightened. If Artie stopped playing abruptly, silence would fall. Silence would invite attention. Attention would invite comments. Comments would invite pride. Pride would invite the kind of problem nobody wanted on New Year's. Eddie moved smoothly toward the stage. He did not rush. Rushing would make the moment visible. He simply arrived, the way a good waiter arrived, as if he had always planned to be there. Eddie positioned himself slightly between the visiting man and the piano, not blocking, just shaping space. He gave the visiting man a calm smile, polite and neutral. "Happy New Year," Eddie offered, as if this was simply a friendly check-in. The visiting man looked Eddie over, mild annoyance flickering. "Happy New Year, we are celebrating." Eddie nodded. "Yes. And the best celebrations do not poke the instruments. Instruments become temperamental." The visiting man laughed, dismissive. "I only asked for a lively song." Eddie kept his tone warm but firm. Lively mean different things to different people. This room prefers lively on the inside. The visiting man's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" Eddie stayed mozzed. "A friend of the room." The visiting man took a sip of champagne and leaned in slightly. "Then you should tell your piano man to play something that makes people clap." Eddie leaned in just enough to keep the conversation private. Clapping is loud. Loud attracts attention. Attention attracts complications. Tonight is not the night for complications. The visiting man studied Eddie, irritation and curiosity mixing. "You talk like you are running this place." Eddie replied evenly. "I talk like I care if the year starts clean." Behind them, Artie let a gentle phrase roll out, the piano line staying smooth, refusing to reflect the tension. Artie was doing his part. Eddie needed to do his. Eddie offered the visiting man a safe alternative. "If you want something specific, tell the waiter quietly, the musicians will consider it." "That is the polite way." The visiting man smirked. "Consider it. Like I am applying for a job." Eddie's voice stayed calm. "In this room, everyone applies. Manners are the membership." The visiting man's smirk faded slightly. A few nearby guests were watching now, pretending not to. Frankie had noticed too. Frankie stood by the bar, smiling lightly while his eyes sharpened. Eddie needed the moment to end without anyone losing face. He chose a gentle exit strategy. "You are a guest. We are grateful you came. Let the music do its work. If you want to feel remembered tonight, sit with your friends and enjoy the champagne." That is how people remember a gentleman, not by how loudly he makes requests. The visiting man held Eddie's gaze. The word gentleman landed. Men like that cared about appearing like gentlemen even when they acted like boys. The visiting man's posture loosened a fraction. He took another sip, then nodded as if he had decided this was not worth his energy. "Fine, I will sit, but I still want something lively later." Eddie nodded. Later is a generous word. The visiting man turned and walked back toward his table with a performed calm, as if he had chosen to leave on his own, which was important. Eddie let him have that. Artie's shoulders relaxed by a degree. The piano continued, smooth and warm. The trio followed, the clarinet line floating like an apology the room did not have to speak. Eddie stepped back from the stage and drifted toward Frankie, keeping his pace unremarkable. Frankie leaned in slightly as Eddie approached. "You saved the music," Eddie replied quietly. It tried to be brave. Frankie's smile held tension for a heartbeat, then softened. "Brave is what ruins parties." Eddie nodded. "Brave belongs outside. This room is for calm." Frankie touched Eddie's shoulder once, quick and thankful, then returned to greeting guests as if nothing had ever threatened the mood. The room resumed its gentle New Year drift. People clinked glasses softly, some hugged briefly, then stepped back like they were embarrassed by their own warmth. Conversation shifted into safer territory. Food was brought out again, small plates meant to keep hands occupied and mouths pleasantly busy. Eddie watched the visiting group carefully. The narrow-eyed man sat down and spoke in a low voice to his companions. He smiled occasionally, a little too controlled. Eddie knew that type. the type that liked to test a room, the type that did not forget when a room refused to bend. Eddie also knew that refusing to bend was sometimes the kindest thing a room could do. It prevented bigger mistakes later. A few minutes after midnight, the music shifted into a brighter tune. Not loud, not rowdy, just slightly more cheerful, a gentle lift that allowed the room to exhale the tension of waiting for the year to change. People laughed again. The older men looked calmer, as if the new year had arrived and not immediately misbehaved, which felt like a small miracle. Eddie noticed the gift basket from the visiting group still sitting by the bar. Frankie had not opened it yet. That was deliberate too. Opening gifts in public created attention, attention created commentary, commentary created interpretations. Frankie would open it later, privately, when the room did not need another topic. Eddie appreciated that. Frankie believed in managing the story of the night. Eddie managed the mechanics. Together, they prevented both chaos and boredom, which was the true art of a calm celebration. Eddie did his rounds again. He checked the waiters. Nico looked steadier now, working near the families, shoulders relaxed. Eddie caught his eye and gave a small nod. Nico returned it, grateful. Eddie checked the doors again. No new faces pushed in. Downstairs remained ordinary. Good. He glanced out the window. The snow had begun to thin, and the streetlights painted the wet cobbles with soft shine. In the distance, faint cheers still rose, but the loudest part of the city had already spent its energy. The new year was settling. Eddie let himself breathe. The almost mistake had passed. The room remained steady. Midnight had arrived and found no reason to start a fight. Eddie touched his second notebook, then decided not to write anything. Some victories did not need ink immediately. Some victories deserved to exist as quiet as they had been earned. He returned to his post near the bar, listening to the piano that remembered things, watching the faces that pretended they did not, and keeping the new year from starting with anything sharper than a clink of glass. Chapter 10. New Day, Old Rules, Small Resolutions. After midnight, the room changed in the way rooms always changed when the main event passed. The sharp anticipation softened into tired relief. People who had been sitting upright all night allowed their shoulders to drop. Laughter sounded less careful. Conversations loosened and drifted toward harmless topics: weather, food, old neighborhood jokes, the eternal mystery of why the city insisted on being so loud. The musicians kept playing, but the set list turned gentler and slower, like a lullaby for grown men who pretended they did not get sleepy. The clarinet floated in warm lines. The piano stayed steady, never dramatic, never shoving. Artie played like he was placing each note carefully on a shelf. Eddie stood near the bar and watched the room settle. This was often the most delicate part of the night. People were safe enough to relax, and relaxed people sometimes got honest. Honest could be sweet. Honest could be dangerous. Honest could turn into a confession nobody wanted to hear over dessert. Frankie moved through the tables again, thanking guests for coming, smiling, guiding energy downward. He did not let the night stretch too long. Parties that went too late gathered strange moods. After midnight, the city itself became a little unstable, like a ship creaking after a storm. Frankie understood that. He believed in endings. Rosa, in the kitchen doorway, watched the room with the satisfaction of a person who had fed a small army without letting the army set anything on fire. Her eyes were tired, but her posture still held authority. She had the look of someone already planning the cleanup in her head, because cleanup was the true final chapter of every celebration. Eddie did his quiet work. He checked the champagne supply. He checked the water pitchers. He checked that bread kept arriving in small baskets to keep hands busy and mouths polite. He checked that the visiting men stayed seated and did not wander again toward the stage. The narrow-eyed visitor had withdrawn into his table's conversation. Occasionally he glanced at Eddie with a controlled expression, as if storing the memory for later. Eddie did not react. Eddie had learned that the best way to deflate a small grudge was to refuse to feed it with attention. A few tables began to break into small goodbyes. Coats were retrieved, hands were shaken, cheeks were kissed briefly with a softness that would have embarrassed them at noon. One older man near the window stood slowly and approached Frankie. He spoke quietly, but his voice carried the weight of long years. "You did good tonight," he murmured. "Quiet. Proper." Frankie bowed his head slightly. "Thank you. That mean a lot." The older man glanced toward Eddie. "And your librarian helped." Frankie smiled, warm. He did. He kept the chairs straight. He kept the year from tripping. The older man nodded once and returned to his family, coat already on. Eddie felt a small warmth behind his ribs, not pride, more like relief that the work had been seen and not taken for granted. Soon the room moved into its winding down phase, the kind where music faded a notch, lights softened further, and servants began clearing with gentle efficiency. People began discussing sleep like it was a luxury item. Frankie clapped his hands lightly once, not loud, just enough to gather attention without claiming it. "Gentlemen, friends, I will not keep you too late. The new year is here. Let us treat it politely by leaving it some science." The room responded with murmurs of agreement and soft laughter. One of the visiting men, the silver-haired leader, approached Frankie near the bar. His tone was smooth, but his eyes stayed careful. "A very pleasant evening. Quiet. Tasteful." Frankie smiled. That was the goal. "Thank you for coming." The man nodded and gestured toward the gift basket. A small token for the kitchen. Rosa, overhearing from a few steps away, lifted her eyebrow. "For me." The silver-haired man smiled politely. "For the kitchen. For you." Rosa nodded as if accepting a prize she had already earned. "Good. I accept. Next time bring olives." These men pretend they do not care, but they care. A few nearby guests laughed softly. The visiting man smiled, perhaps surprised to be corrected by an apron. The narrow-eyed younger visitor hovered behind him for a moment, then leaned slightly toward Eddie, voice low. "You keep a tight room." Eddie kept his tone neutral. "Quiet rooms are easier on the ears." The younger man's mouth tightened. "Quiet rooms are also difficult to enter." Eddie gave him a calm look. "That is why they stay quiet." The younger man held Eddie's gaze for a beat, then forced a small smile. "Happy New Year." "Happy New Year," Eddie replied evenly. The men gathered their coats and left, moving down the stairs and out into the city with the careful dignity of people who wanted to be remembered well. The door closed behind them, and Eddie felt the room exhale. A small exhale, but real. Frankie drifted back to Eddie and spoke quietly. "They are gone." Eddie nodded. "The room feels lighter." Frankie's smile held mild amusement. "Imagine that. Less testing, more breathing." Eddie glanced toward the stage. Artie and the trio were finishing a final gentle number, slow enough to smooth the last edges of the night. When it ended, Artie let his hands rest on the keys for a moment, as if thanking the piano for cooperating. The clarinet man began packing his case with calm efficiency. The Sorelli brothers folded their stands. Their movements were unhurried, because unhurried was the whole theme. Eddie approached the musicians and offered quiet thanks. "You saved the night." Artie lifted his eyes and gave the smallest nod. The night saved itself by staying polite. The clarinet man added, "A room that respects instruments is a room that respects itself." Eddie smiled faintly. "I will remember that." The clarinet man made a sound of approval and snapped his case shut. "Good. Remember it then." Frankie handled payment discreetly, away from eyes, because money did not need to be part of the atmosphere. The musicians left with their cases, stepping into the cold like they were stepping out of a warm story. One by one, the remaining guests departed. Handshakes became softer. Goodbyes became warmer. The older men left early, as planned, because older men appreciated sleep more than fireworks. The younger men lingered a little longer, but the food and the gentle music kept them from getting too brave. Even bravado grew tired eventually. At last the room held only staff, Frankie, Eddie, Rosa, and a handful of waiters clearing the final plates. The buzz of guests was gone. In its place was the quiet hum of cleanup, the clink of glass, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of workers who knew the night had ended without damage. Rosa stepped into the dining room fully now, hands on hips, scanning the aftermath like a general inspecting a battlefield. No broken glasses, no spilled wine on linens, no chair thrown, no shouting. My favourite kind of miracle. Eddie let a dry note enter his voice. We should frame the tablecloths. Rosa gave him a look. Do not joke. Someone will take it seriously, and then I will have to sew. Frankie laughed quietly, the sound of a man letting go of control at last. We did it, Rosa agreed, and then she turned her gaze to Eddie. And you. Eat something before you leave. If you go out into the cold with nothing in your stomach, you will faint, and I will have to deal with a body, Eddie replied mildly. You have a talent for making care sound like a threat. Rosa nodded once. It saves time. Frankie leaned against the bar and exhaled, the kind of exhale that emptied a whole evening's worth of tension. He looked at Eddie with that friendly warmth that made people trust him, even when trusting him could be complicated. You were steady tonight, Frankie murmured. That is not easy. Eddie shrugged lightly, but his eyes stayed thoughtful. It is easier to be steady than to be dramatic. Frankie's smile softened. You say that, but drama gets applause, Eddie replied calmly. Steady gets sleep. Rosa snorted. Sleep is more valuable than applause. Applause does not heal your feet. Frankie looked down at his shoes as if acknowledging their complaint. That is true. The staff continued clearing. Eddie helped where he could without getting in the way. He stacked folded napkins, he carried empty trays. He checked the guest list last time not to count who came but to confirm who left. Leaving mattered. When the room was almost reset, Frankie lifted the gift basket from the visiting men and placed it on a side table near the kitchen doorway. Rosa crossed her arms. Open it. Frankie raised an eyebrow. Publicly, in front of witnesses. Rosa tilted her head. Witnesses are good. Witnesses prevent misunderstandings. Frankie smiled, resigned, and removed the ribbon carefully. Inside were assorted luxury items, fancy imported sweets, a bottle of expensive oil, a tin of cookies, and a note without a name, written in clean handwriting, a polite line about respect in the future. Rosa inspected it and made a small sound. Clever. They give sugar so you cannot spit. Eddie leaned in slightly. Any traps? Rosa sniffed the oil like a judge sniffing evidence. No trap, just performance. Performance is not poison. It is only tiring. Frankie folded the note and set it aside. We will thank them politely tomorrow. Quietly. Eddie nodded. Quietly is the correct volume. Their work finished. Frankie gestured toward the windows. Outside, the street had changed. The loud midnight moment was gone. The city had entered the softer hours. Snow still fell, lighter now, and the streetlights made it look like slow glitter. The distant roar had turned into scattered laughter and occasional complaining car horns. Frankie looked at Eddie. Walk with me for a minute. Eddie considered. He was tired. He wanted to go home and sleep for a year, but a short walk would help him unwind. It would also allow him to verify that the street had cooled back into normal. Eddie nodded. They stepped outside together. The cold hit gently now, less sharp than earlier, as if the night itself had calmed after its own performance. Their breath showed in the air. Their shoes crunched lightly on snow. The street was quieter. Some people still wandered, hats crooked, voices soft, searching for the last bit of magic. A few men leaned against a wall smoking, laughter low. In the distance, a street sweeper moved slowly, scraping away confetti and hope. Frankie stared up the street for a moment. You know, Eddie, tonight could have gone differently. Eddie replied evenly. It usually can. Frankie smiled faintly. And you kept it from doing that. Eddie looked at the snow, then back at Frankie. I did small things. Chairs, deliveries, music, bread. Frankie nodded. Small things. They walked in silence for a few steps, letting the city breathe around them. Eddie noticed something he had not noticed earlier because he had been too busy managing. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Not innocent, but peaceful. A street could be complicated and still peaceful. That was the strange miracle of New York. They reached the church steps again. The door was closed. The candles inside were dim. The building sat in the snow like a steady thought. Frankie stopped and looked at it quietly. "People think this neighborhood is made of loud stories," Eddie replied softly. "Loud stories sell papers." Frankie nodded. "Quiet stories build lives." Eddie felt that line land in his chest. Quiet stories build lives. It was true. Tonight had been a quiet story, built with bread and chairs and slow music and steady faces. Frankie turned toward Eddie again. "What will you do tomorrow?" Eddie hesitated. Tomorrow was today, technically, but the new day had not fully begun in his mind yet. Still, the question mattered. It was a question about intention, about the shape of the next year. Eddie chose a small resolution, not dramatic, not poetic. Tomorrow I will sleep. Then I will get up and I will eat breakfast. Then I will write my accounts and make my lists, and I will try to keep doing the small work. Frankie smiled, warm. That is the most Eddie answer possible. Eddie added, "And I will try to stay out of newspapers." Frankie laughed softly. "Ah, that is ambitious," Eddie replied with a tiny hint of humor. "I like ambitious goals. It gives the year something to laugh at." Frankie's smile softened again, and for a moment he looked less like a host and more like a man grateful to be standing in quiet snow instead of in a room full of expectations. They turned back toward the restaurant. Behind them the church remained steady. Ahead the streetlights continued their slow glow. At the restaurant door Frankie paused. "Happy New Year, Eddie." "Happy New Year, Frankie." Frankie went inside to finish the last details with staff. Eddie stayed outside a moment longer, breathing in the cold air, letting it clear his head. In the distance he saw Detective Pike walking down the street with his coat collar up, moving slowly like he was finally letting the night settle. Pike glanced over, met Eddie's gaze briefly and gave the smallest nod. A tired nod that meant the city stayed quiet enough. "Thank you." Eddie returned the nod. Then Eddie started walking toward home. His shoes made soft crunch sounds in the snow. Mulberry Street was quieter now. The year had turned. The city was still the city. The rules were still the rules. People would still want what they wanted, and the calendar would not change human nature in a single night. But Eddie felt something close to peace. Not dramatic peace. Not a speech-shaped peace. Just the simple peace of a night that ended without turning sharp. He reached his building, climbed the stairs, and paused with his hand on the door. Before going in, he took out his second notebook and wrote one last line, short and plain, the kind of line that belonged to mornings. "Keep doing the small work." He closed the notebook, stepped inside, and let the new year begin the way he preferred, quietly.